Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders. Welcome to episode 73 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. It is actually a very historic day today, and we're going to be covering that from the Bitcoin perspective, from the macro perspective, and the geopolitical perspective, as always. The reason for that is because today's video is actually a big transition that we are witnessing right in front of our eyes. Part of the US dollar proof of weapons network is slowly but surely in phase one going to be phased with US utilizing proof of work, Bitcoin's peaceful proof of work, as the very first part of the resistance against the violence, the death and destruction of the Federal Reserve. But it is being transferred over to the European Union proof of weapons network. And we are going to see right in front of us the difference between what happens when you go for the peaceful proof of work versus the European Union's proof of weapons. We're going to be discussing all about that today. So we're going to be going through from the perspective of Bitcoin, from the perspective of macro, and from the perspective of geopolitics. And so today, if you are new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2 decades of my life obsessing over the topic of monetary reform, whether it come from Bitcoin, macro, from investing. And I've been helping people and documenting the whole journey as we transition to a world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. From the recording on this YouTube channel of me speaking at the very first Bitcoin conference, all through to the journey where we are today, where our industry and many of the companies that I invested in and our Bank to the Future investors invested in, about 7 of them, are meeting in the White House as they announce the American Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Asset Strategy. The very first phase that we've been advocating every country to utilize, as ever since Satoshi Nakamoto gave us the ability to fight from the oppression of the central banking warmongers that were designed in order to bankrupt countries and make sure that their debt was used for the benefit of the military-industrial complex and the financial institutions that are the very same shareholders of the central banking system that was designed based upon weapons and violence. We are witnessing the first phase, and we will be documenting the journey through phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and all of the resistance that we can do. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about whether governments get the moves right, because we're able to opt out with Bitcoin. We can harness proof of work, and we can enjoy the journey while the central banking system is destroying the wealth of others. And so we're going to be going through all of that today. In the first section, we're going to be covering from the Bitcoin perspective the significance of the White House Bitcoin Strategic Reserve announcement that is going to be happening in the right after this broadcast, in fact, at the White House. In the macro section, we're going to be discussing further impacts of the tariffs. The tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China are now real. It wasn't a negotiating tactic. And we move to the next phase on April the 2nd. We'll discuss all about that. We'll also be discussing the dismantling of the EuroDollar as we transition, as we discussed, and the escalation the escalation that's happening with the petrodollar. We'll cover all of that in the macro section. And then finally, isn't it amazing how a week makes a world of difference? Last week, we ended where we were talking about what was going to happen with the White House meeting with Zelensky as he met Trump. And we got all the theatrics. I'll be making sure that you don't listen to what they're saying, but follow the money to understand what may happen next in the geopolitical landscape so that we can prepare ourselves as we transition to this world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. In the geopolitical section, I'll be breaking down the bit that you weren't told about what happened in the Zelensky White House humiliation ritual. And, of course, discuss what the next phase might be for the European Union proof of weapons network as we make this historical transition. So with that in mind, let us jump straight in with part one, this week in Bitcoin. What did we get? Let me just go through the events of this week to kind of let you know that how we're making history here and how this led to where we are today. So it was announced at the beginning of this week that it wasn't going to be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. It was going to be a crypto strategic reserve. And it was going to consist of, in the initial announcement, Solana, XRP, Cardano ADA, and then immediately another post followed saying, of course, we're going to be doing Bitcoin and ETH as well. And what you can see here is that very clearly, these ideas are being tested on social media, seeing how they stick. The feedback is coming through, and we are actually dictating policy to some degree as we give our feedback through the fact that there is real-time media feedback right now. And of course, upon all of these announcements, you got incredible pump and dumps. And of course, as always, political insiders and those connected to the proof of weapons network that are kissing the ring of Donald Trump right now would have got some insider information and would have been able to preempt those moves to get on the right side of the pump and dump. But if you've been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, you don't fall for any of that stuff, because your job is just to own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month and beat the Federal Reserve, rather than falling for the fake blockchain fiat currency money printing of these shitcoins that are pre-mined in order to fool you away from your Bitcoin, because you end up trading and gambling and leveraging and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But of course, you won't fall for that. But those that did fall for that, the insiders win and 99% of the other people lose. But anyway, every announcement led to its own pump and dump and its own insider trading and its own in types of things that are happening. But immediately after that, when we were getting all of these corrections, all of these pumps, all of these, 50% rise in XRP, and then the dump that comes from it after all of these announcements, we had another announcement which said that the White House is going to be hosting the first ever crypto summit on March the 7th. That is today, and it will start after Bitcoin Hard Talk. Will end just before it starts to begin. Now, obviously, throughout social media, there were complaints saying, what about my shitcoin? Saying, well, I thought we were doing Bitcoin. I don't want taxpayers' money making Brad Garlinghouse rich because he, financed some of the Trump administration with some coins that he printed. And so, therefore, why should taxpayers' money go on that? And there was lots of pivots around this. And so what did we have? The next announcement, basically the feedback was coming through social media that basically David Sachs, who's the crypto czar, and Trump, who's really outsourcing the policy to the crypto czar because, he's meant to be negotiating world peace right now. Bigger things to fry. It was really the pushback initially when they said crypto strategic reserve rather than Bitcoin strategic reserve. There was all sorts of videos that came out saying that this is defrauding billions of dollars from taxpayers into the pockets of the founders of those coins and the companies connected to those coins and the bodies that were part of the crypto lobby and those that were benefiting from these pre-mined coins. And so that became a really unpopular message. You can't say the same for Bitcoin. There's no founder. Satoshi Nakamoto was anonymous, left the project a long time ago. I have my speculations over who I think it is, and I believe they are no longer with us. And so there's no founder, there's no pre-mine, there's no unfair launch. And so it gets that type of feedback. You get that type of pushback when you put this in front of millions of people. Essentially, it's asset stripping of the dollar. So the dollar is debt-based, proof of weapons, needs war in order to thrive, in order to increase the money supply. And as the supply increases, it wipes out middle-class America and confiscates assets that go from those that are not connected to the proof of weapons network and are borrowing 30% on credit card and 40% payday loans, and transfers that wealth over to those that can borrow at 0% in order to purchase assets utilizing the debt of the proof of weapons network. And that's what we have seen ever since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, a confiscation of wealth and the asset stripping of all the assets of America, to the point where the courtocracy, the technocracy, whatever you want to call it, is way more powerful than the government, just like you're seeing with Elon right now, having more power. And the lobby then is what determines politics, as opposed to what is right for the everyday American people. And so this is essentially a form of asset stripping. If somebody can print a token, and then they can get the US government to print some dollars, and then that dollars is used in order to acquire that token from a company, and then they end up getting rich, and that and then everyone else that wasn't involved in that, they end up paying the inflation. And so, quite right, it is not right to do this with shit coins. That I'm a shareholder in Ripple Labs, and the more that happens, the more the Ripple Labs shareholders make a load of money. And so, that's not how you make a difference. This is crony capitalism to the highest degree. This is why Bitcoin proof of work is different. This is why it's backed by the largest distributed supercomputer. This is why it's apolitical. This is why everybody ends up capitulating to Bitcoin. And this is why you can mess around with short-term price manipulation. But the much easier thing to do is own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, and keep doing that through the 4-year cycles, and beat the money printing of the Federal Reserve and the network of economic hitmen that perpetuate dollar debt around the world through the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and other organizations like the World Bank, designed to enslave the world at the expense of the rich people in America. That's the way the system was designed. And all the debt obviously benefits the banks, and the banks are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve. And at this point, it is blatantly obvious that the Federal Reserve was also created by the same people that created the Bank of England. And that is what led to the slow transition of constitutional capitalist America over to socialist, to the point where you have to fire half the government, and you have to go through austerity, and you have to crash the stock markets in order to return to some normality, because it's driving us to World War III, when everyone is having all of their money that's being printed sucked up into the dollar proof of works weapons network. And then the US government, through crony capitalism, is using it to fund wars and overthrow governments around the world. And then you end up basically paying for the destruction of yourself. And so obviously, when you wipe out middle-class America, eventually you end up extreme left, extreme right populism. And then that leads to civil war, unrest, revolutions. And when that happens, you tend to get external forces that are pissed off with the system, figured out a way of exiting central banking by utilizing real resources like gold, oil, or Bitcoin, or any other real asset that beats the proof of weapons network. And then they use that to build power, and then they end up wanting to change the world order, which is what we experienced, that hit a tipping point under the Biden administration, and is now in strategic retreat because Russia won that war. Now we're reforming the proof of weapons network, which is a proxy war between US and Russia. And Russia was aligned with BRICS, and now a rising power has said, let's not go to World War III. And so Trump is doing a strategic retreat in the name of MAGA and America First. And that's what we're witnessing right now. So the pre-mined coins are kind of like fiat currency, right? And so people were saying, this isn't what we signed up for. You got a load of people in the community, even those that own exchanges and engage with all other coins and stuff. They were saying Bitcoin's completely different. You can't call it a strategic reserve. It makes a mockery, because why? A strategic reserve is actually a very, very important term. It means that you use it as reserves in organized either through a central bank or through treasury to protect yourself from the central bank. But also the proof of weapons network has weaponized that term in order to perpetuate demand for dollar, which is heavily concentrated in the hands of central banks and wealthy oligarchs, and push out dollar debt. And so by using that term, it means that everyone is skewed towards dollars and gold. Now, if you get to print the dollar, that gives you an exorbitant privilege, which is why America is America. But eventually, it reaches to a level of wealth inequality where the whole thing blows up because now the average person can't afford anything. And so when you classify Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, that term has been weaponized by the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. And now the International Monetary Fund are in a bit of a dilemma, because if the administration then classifies Bitcoin as a strategic reserve in the American economy to defend itself from the financial weapons of mass destruction and the occupation of the Federal Reserve, then the IMF, when it's going to countries like El Salvador and saying you can't use Bitcoin as strategic reserves, all right, well, America has suddenly defined it, and now the global South gets to defend itself from the very institution, the International Monetary Fund, that in the post-World War II global order created the death and destruction, wars, and the complete annihilation of the balance sheet of the American Treasury to the point where it's $36 trillion in debt with $250 trillion of committed liabilities. And that is what we are witnessing right in front of us right now. And so by making Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset, we create this bottom-up movement. And you know what? The market was so dumb. This was your classic, the market not understanding. Because of all the news, people were expecting an announcement that they're going to buy 1 million Bitcoin or something. And because that didn't happen, the market started to correct. And it's now below $90,000 because people were waiting for the US government to buy it. I'll go through in detail why they have missed the point. And they have missed the point in a big way, which creates a beautiful opportunity for you to accumulate some Bitcoin under 90,000 if it is your time to accumulate at the moment. Make as much fiat currency, boycott the Federal Reserve, save in Bitcoin. I know more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Get yourself the ability to de-enslave yourself, decolonize yourself from dollar debt, and keep doing it, wash, rinse, repeat until you are free. That is a mission that we should all be on. But now America, if this goes through, has the opportunity to free itself from the Federal Reserve, which is 100% necessary right now. And that is what strategic reserves should be about. It's not doing what Czech Republic's doing, where Czech Republic is allowing the central bank to accumulate the Bitcoin and exploring that. It is when you allow the treasury to accumulate the Bitcoin. And therefore, it gives the option that those countries occupied by the proof of weapons network don't have with their debt-based Ponzi schemes that's driving the government to become huge, bloated, corrupt, and massive through the financial weapons of mass destruction of the Federal Reserve. So what you should be doing is what we ended up with, using Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, because it is the only digital commodity that is hard money with a fixed supply that cannot be manipulated by any government, no matter how much resources they have long term, and is geopolitically neutral in terms of the geographical locations that are mining it and all the mining pools and the node operators and the way that Satoshi designed it. Now, if you want to be strategic, there could be an argument, and I could make an argument for you. You know, I have a little bit of my reserves in protecting from unforeseen scenarios. Like I invested in the Ethereum ICO and I stake that ETH still to this day. I convert the stakes to Bitcoin periodically, but I'm making sure that I'm hedging from certain scenarios. I also know that there is a 1-2 punch that came from Bitcoin, because launched on top of Bitcoin in 2014 was a stable coin called Tether. And that is a very large stable coin right now. And the other part of this equation is defunding or taking down the fractional reserve banking system, Remember, the Fed gives the ability to create the dollar and the currency to the private banks, and they get to create it every time they issue a loan. And if you have a positive balance in your online banking, someone else has a negative balance. And full reserve banking is how we started. When I first, when we first started, myself and my wife started Bank to the Future, we were fed up of teaching politicians that fractional reserve banking is a Ponzi scheme. And instead, we decided we wanted to create a bank. And so the original vision of Bank to the Future was we were applying at the Bank of England, saying we want to create full reserve banking where people own their money, people can spend their money, and we don't want to lever up the balance sheet. And they said, no, you can't do that. You need to put all your deposits with an existing bank that is actually connected to the Bank of England, and we won't give you a license if you don't want to lever up. And so we pivoted to working on Bitcoin and funding many of the companies with our pool, network of investors that are now at the White House setting the future policy as well with the White House. And that's going to be shaped around the world. Now, in 2014, one of the companies that we invested in, Bitfinex, purchased a stablecoin and Tether, and created a digital dollar that was fully reserved and backed. Now, at some points it wasn't, and other points it is. Now it's had attestations and now is moving to audit. And other stable coins were launched. We invested in companies like Circle that launched USDC as well. Now, what are they backed on? They exist on other networks. What are those networks? Proof of stake. What is proof of stake? Proof of stake means whoever owns the stake controls the network. So those money printers and those people that want to get into this industry, now it's here, if they want to control the rails of the stable coins, then they just need to control the blockchains that operate off proof of stake. So there may be a bias towards proof of stake. Now, hopefully it happens on Bitcoin Lightning, which will have privacy enhancements and cheaper fees and be genuinely decentralized. But there's a risk that it may happen on the alternative proof of stake change. And I think incentives align to that happening, which is why I hold some of my position in ETH, for example, so that I can benefit from the fees that are generated, convert into Bitcoin or whatever it may be. And you get a hedge because I want to be in a position where no matter what happens in the world, I'm okay. And that's the idea behind hedges. And so you could make an argument that a strategic reserve would include stakes in the major proof of stake networks to be strategically important in case everything goes onto a stablecoin standard. And we end up with the ability to take on the fractional reserve banks through stablecoins, which is the next battle. Bitcoin strategic reserves taking on the central bank, stablecoins taking on the fractional reserve system, and then defining who actually regulates those, which is the market, market strategy or market timing. Who's going to regulate those will be depending on, because those are centralized types of chains as well. But anyway, you could make an argument that for stablecoin strategic reasons, you might want to own some of those tokens. Okay, so that's more like a strategic stockpile because you're holding a stockpile in case something goes wrong. And that is the definition of a stockpile. So strategic reserves allows you to engage in future currency wars as Bitcoin becomes important to all jurisdictions. A strategic stockpile would be owning some of the proof of stake coins so that you can make sure the stablecoin network is certainly controlled. But, putting XRP and Solana and all of these different things, really, because those are pre-mined, it's pure extraction. So you can't justify using taxpayers' money in order to purchase any of those tokens. It's crony capitalism to the highest degree. They were pre-mined, and now they're selling them using taxpayers. It's not taxpayers' money, let's face it. It's using inflation and some taxpayers' money. And that's why if you want to do that, you have to do it through a sovereign wealth fund, which is the third element. A sovereign wealth fund is where you have a cash flow or you have wealth like through exporting oil or gas or resources. And then you have excess surplus reserves that you then want to invest strategically. And so you could say, we'd like these blockchains to be built in America, and therefore we'll invest through our sovereign wealth fund in order to attract companies to build their blockchains within America. And that is the three-tiered structure that has become very obvious and apparent. And based upon the mechanism of publishing and getting feedback, it's pretty much exactly where the US ended up. Amazingly, the model has been set, and it could not have been set better. And those idiots that were expecting the government to buy 1 million Bitcoin right away and are now selling their Bitcoin because they're essentially fiat currency thinkers rather than buying Bitcoin into corrections are on the wrong side of the trade all over again. And that is because the market completely misinterpreted the power of what actually did get set up. Now, what is this? This could be, if it was set up correctly, strategically, a takeover of much of the stakes of the proof of stake networks. That's why Bitcoin proof of work is the way for us to free ourselves from the oppression of corporate takeover or from government takeover or from central bank takeover, which is the mission. Now, proof of stake will go through exactly that. And it will, essentially be a network for stable coins in order to allow the government to borrow more. And that will cause problems to the central, the banking system. And it will enrich the venture capitalists and the shitcoin casinos and all the exchanges and stuff. That's why, essentially, rather than messing around with all these alternatives, we started funding exchanges and getting equity in exchanges. So whatever happens in the market, the exchanges will benefit from that. And this is the construct of, some of the things that I'll be teaching later this year. We've set a date, by this way, to start the free video series Bitcoin Wealth Builder program. Going to be starting in June. And hopefully there'll be no further delays, but we're putting this all together anyway. We did this after every halving cycle, where I publish online exactly how I invest, free for anyone to see. And then we analyze what happened in the whole cycle so you can see, even starting from scratch. I said, right, well, I'll invest live, but what would I do if I were starting from scratch? Because people always come to me, yeah, Simon, you were there right from the beginning when it was $3. And I say to them, yes, but I would do the same if I were starting from scratch today. And so I'll make sure I do that again in June. If you are not a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, it's a free portal where I back up all these videos, and you can see the previous one that I did like 4 years ago, 5 years ago after the last halving. And you can get my book from 2011, the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, all completely free. Head over to simondixon.com, hit that yellow button, and you'll be on the mailing list. And I make sure that you are in that membership portal where I release all these things as well to make sure everyone's done. But anyway, the complaint was that taxpayer money, shouldn't be funding these investments, and that's quite right. It should be done by what they actually announced, which is they called it market neutral. And so, tax neutral, I think is the word. I'll go through the exact wording because it's very important. But tax neutral means take assets that the government already has and convert some of them to Bitcoin if you want to accumulate a Bitcoin position. So one of the examples is gold, because it was confiscated from the American people after the Federal Reserve created a pump and dump in the roaring 20s and crashed the market to accumulate the assets in the 1930s that led to the Great Depression. And then in 33, it was demanded that all Americans need to hand in their gold. And now they're requiring an audit that hasn't been done to find out whether the gold is still in Fort Knox. But you could take that gold that is currently priced at $42 as per law, fiat, and you could actually reprice it to the market. And then you could use that in order to accumulate Bitcoin. That's $500 billion right there if you wanted. But also you could use strategic strategies. For example, at the moment, and I'll cover more of this in the macro and geopolitical section, America and Europe are in a proxy war, because that is what the Ukraine war was. It was a CI operation, as everybody that's been following this on Bitcoin Hard Talk already knows, in order to make Europe dependent upon American gas that is very expensive, that led to the sacrificing of the European economy, while it led to rampant inflation. And the proof of weapons network was used in order to take down big players in the crypto market some of the fake implants like SBF from FTX, use that in order to then use the corruption at the SEC to wipe out a bunch of companies and then approve a Bitcoin ETF so that BlackRock can fool you into not self-custody your Bitcoin, but giving it to BlackRock instead. And that was a very strategic strategy. The Federal Reserve, if you go through its history, has done this approximately 20 times in order to fool you out of your assets, because it is a globalist institution that came from European bankers that co-opted American bankers in order to do exactly what the Bank of England did to England, which is make it broke, asset strip it, and hand over to the assets to the oligarchs and the shareholders of the central bank. Well, anyway, you could use that in order to buy Bitcoin, and therefore you do not use taxpayers' money. But if you wanted to launch an attack on the UK, for example, remember that happened when Liz Truss broke the UK pension system and she had to retire after 40 days because the Bank of England said, we need to do a strategic bailout of your policy, so therefore we're going to wipe you out and replace you with, I think it was Rishi Sunak next. Can't remember exactly who was next. I forget, the Bank of England, and they've just turned over, the corrupt lobby, the crony capitalism just turns over prime ministers in the UK. Keir Starmer is the latest one, really shilling for the European Central Bank agenda to take over the Fed's proof of weapons network in this war. And you could, for example, fight back against that if you wanted. And you could say, I'm going to sell UK gilts if they had some of them in their strategic reserves. And that would create a crash in the UK gilt market. And then you could use it to buy Bitcoin, and you can essentially use it for the same types of currency wars. But everybody can do that. And that is the beauty of Bitcoin. The countries that build their strategic reserves will have the strategic strategies to fight against the remnants of the proof of weapons network tools like gilts and like treasuries and various other things, which is why El Salvador has led the charge. And now America is doing it. And now the rest of the world can do it before they do it bigger, do it faster, do it better. And remember, America is a $27 trillion economy, but it's $36 trillion of debt. Revenue is vanity. Profit is sanity. The reason that Russia won, even though it's a much smaller economy, is because it's 22% debt to GDP and it utilizes its vast oil resources. We'll go through a bit more about that. And that was the war that was waged. It was to take out Russia and weaken Europe. But now they're in a strategic retreat and dismantling the EuroDollar, which is the construct that this war was all about. Anyway, we'll cover more on that anyway. So you could use that. You sell UK gilts in order to buy Bitcoin. And then you could say, well, we don't want you to go to war. And therefore you could have those types of currency war policies if you are the first. And that is the game theory. Power comes from those that adopt the Bitcoin strategic reserves earlier, just like those who were buying Bitcoin earlier, they have more power, lobby power if they wanted, than everyone else right now. And that is still early because you are front running the strategic reserves. Anyway, you can use it, to rebalance your portfolio strategically. And that is why Bitcoin is so different from everything else. Right. So right after that, we had the next announcement, which pumped the market again. So basically, Trump came out and said that he is going to unveil the US Bitcoin reserve strategy at the White House crypto summit, which is the one that's happening today after Bitcoin Hard Talk. Sorry, that wasn't Trump. That came out from the Commerce Secretary of the Trump administration under Howard Lutnick. And Howard Lutnick is Cantor Fitzgerald. He's the reason why Tether's got a seat around the table, because he is custodying that. And in this crony capitalism, asset stripping economy that America currently is right now, as it does these strategic retreats and hands over all the assets, and you get to protect yourself with Bitcoin, rather than being on the wrong side, as all of these corrupt, crony capitalist politicians are stripping all of America's assets and handing it over to themselves, just like Trump is doing right now, in the name of MAGA, of course. as we transition to this more regional power, now that America is no longer a global power as a result of losing the Russian proxy war. Okay, so then what came out? Well, then we had our market pump and dumps, and you can see the PR narrative. Obviously, America is a PR economy. It's all about sharing narratives, fake it till you make it, and then manifesting it into existence. And then, that's kind of how things work. And you're seeing it in the Trump administration. Now, what happened next? Well, Trump then signed an executive order to establish, this time, not a strategic crypto reserve, but a strategic Bitcoin reserve. That happened yesterday. And if you're not following me on X, by the way, you get all these updates in real time, and you can ask me questions when I'm on Spaces as well, so we can engage more. So make sure you follow me on X. But that was the next move. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, now we're moving towards exactly how it should be. But of course, the crony capitalist benefited from the pump and dumps that happened as a result of changing the language from crypto strategic reserve to Bitcoin strategic reserve. Then the crypto Tsar, David Sachs, came out, and he was the one, when Trump signed the executive order, Trump was saying, so you think this is how we should be doing it? And he was, yes, this is the way, which is awesome. He came out and started hinting at, by the way, the US government sold 195,000 Bitcoin. Now, that when they sold it, and remember who they sold it to, there were all those auctions. Where did it come from? It came from the Silk Road. So let me just give you a little bit of history. So Bitcoin was created to take down the Federal Reserve and the proof of weapons network. One of the first use cases was taking down the intelligence agency drug cartels like the CIA and MI6 and Mossad that created this network of jurisdictions to allow for the flow of drug trafficking, human trafficking, pedophilia, blackmail rings, as we're finding out in these drops. And so a gentleman called Ross Ulbright decided to use Bitcoin in order to create a decentralized marketplace. And you could use Bitcoin in order to transact with people in a peer-to-peer way where there was no centralized server and there was no centralized controlled currency. And this created, a safe way for those, I don't endorse this, but a safe way for those that decided, rather than buy drugs from gangsters, buy them online where there's a safe way of doing it. I don't need to go in the streets and risk being shot. And I don't need to accept whatever my local gangster is willing to give me. There could be quality control and ratings. And it created this marketplace where it was a lot safer to engage in pure, natural types of things rather than all the chemically induced ones. And that was one of the first use cases of Bitcoin. And so the strategic reserves that America's using right now were the confiscated Bitcoin from taking down Ross Ulbright, because he tried to compete with the intelligence agencies that are still to this day the real reason why there is a fentanyl crisis within America. Because the Fed creates the wars, that then sends people over to fight those wars. When they come back mentally ill because they're killing, for the benefit of profit without knowing it, because they thought they were doing it for their country, and they have to engage in acts of killing children and civilians as comes from this network, they come back mentally ill. America doesn't look after them anymore because the proof of weapons network is for the profits of the military industrial complex, not the victims of the military industrial complex. They end up mentally ill, homeless, and they need to buy drugs. And so they end up with the CIA's chemically induced ones rather than actually the safe ones. And so they took out that network, and then they auctioned off the Bitcoin, and they took the 195,000 Bitcoin, they sold it for $366 million over the last decade. Today, David Sachs told us that if that Bitcoin, if they had kept it, it would be worth $7 billion today. So it was hinting around that. And isn't it ironic that the Trump administration released Ross Ulbright, pardoned him after 10 years of essentially creating a marketplace to take down the CIA? He is now free, but America is still confiscating those coins in order to build their strategic reserves. Even saying that they have 200,000 Bitcoin when they only really have 100,000, because one of the companies that we bailed out from a hack which the person behind those hacks is now in prison, which was funded through the Ukrainian proof of weapons network, taken down by the FBI, and then there were corrupt FBI agents that got arrested and now in prison because they tried to steal all the Bitcoin, because they're part of the drug trafficking and cartel networks that exist. And so they ended up in prison. And in 2016, 119,000 of those Bitcoin was hacked from customers of Bitfinex. And now we've gone full circle. At Bank to the Future, we helped victims of that hack. They ended up with equity in Bitfinex. And now the coins have been retrieved, and they need to do an audit to find out who owns those coins. But there was a court case that said Bitfinex owns those coins. So those coins are now returning to Bitfinex shareholders, which was some of the original, I'm a shareholder, full disclosure, and the Bank to the Future shareholders that we supported in recovering from that. And America's trying to take those and say, yeah, we need to audit it because we're not sure who owns them. But they are already over 100,000 of them belong to Bitfinex. And Howard Lutnick, crony capitalist, Secretary of Commerce, makes sure that Tether gets a seat at the table in the White House meeting, because now America wants to launch its own stable coins, and Trump created his own stable coin through World Liberty Financial, who's also sat at the table as all these organizations asset strip America. And hopefully you're protecting yourself with Bitcoin as we transition to this crony capitalist, and all of America's resources are poured over to artificial intelligence, and we hand it over to the stablecoin issuers that are now taking all the big data and taking all the resources and pulling it into artificial intelligence. This is why you need to protect yourself. Make as much money as you can over the next 10 years in fiat currency, because artificial intelligence will have your job when it's combined with robotics. And Bitcoin is the way of beating the proof of weapons network. Get on the right side of history. And if you get on the wrong side, you will be a universal basic income recipient, paying off your debt using a central bank digital currency, or you will be a pawn for the stablecoin issuers that control all the artificial intelligence data, as the stablecoin issuers take over the government, depending on whether they allow the central bank to win or the technocrats to win. That is the battle of the future. Bitcoin is the solution. Okay, anyway, so then what happens? Well, David Sachs then came out and clarified the day before today's meeting at the White House. And what did he say? Let me read through some of the quotes. So remember what I've told you earlier. This is why the devil is in the detail. Take your time to watch Bitcoin Hard Talk each week. Now, do me a favor. If you think that this is not the type of information you can get anywhere else, we have been oppressed by YouTube, because in the geopolitical section, I revealed the truth that later gets revealed by US aid and everything right now. But I got severely suppressed. I need to get my YouTube account reviewed. If I get to 100,000 subscribers, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, say, oh, I get a blue check. And then the blue check means I go for a manual review, and then they can say, well, you were actually telling the truth. It just seemed like a conspiracy theory at the time. And then we can get our message out to many more people, and I can start ranking in the algorithms at the moment. Right now, I just rely upon those on my mailing list and those that come in and tune in and hit the subscribe button, the bell symbol, all, and then they get an email. So if you can help me get to 100,000, please do that as well. As a backup, I put everything on Bitcoin Hard Talk, so join my mailing list. And as a backup, I also put everything on Rumble, which now Tether has made a strategic investment in order to try and make sure that a centralized company gets some more free speech. So go follow me on Rumble as well. So whatever happens, and I'll also back it up on Nostr, the decentralized network, as that gets more traction. All the things we have to do to maintain freedom of speech. Anyway, what did he also say? So the reserve will be capitalized with Bitcoin owned by the federal government. That means not owned by the Federal Reserve, owned by Treasury. And it will be Bitcoin. And it will be the Bitcoin that was forfeited as part of criminal and civil asset forfeitures proceedings. Now, obviously, this incentivized the criminals at the government to forfeit more. So that's why we hold it in self-custody, so they don't get forfeited, and we stay on the right side of the network and law, obviously. But that's why you don't hold it with BlackRock, because if they want to strategically take your Bitcoin, they just nationalize a backlog ETF, or you don't hold it through MicroStrategy that's got 500,000 Bitcoin, because they might nationalize that. And you can see Michael Saylor is clearly an American asset right now, because he has pivoted to the exact narrative away from what he used to say around the crypto vision and various other things. Once you become that big, you become an asset. So, China, they just blatantly say it. You can't become that big. In America, you just become a covert asset. So they work on the same model, and it is basically the same thing, but one's deceitful, one's out in the open. Anyway, and obviously America, the big distinction is they do hold free speech. But right now, the First Amendment is being called into question. I'll cover that more in the macro and geopolitical section. There are violations of the First Amendment. Be careful. In Europe, our freedom of speech is being eroded through surveillance. But you got to keep hold, if you're an American, of your First and Second Amendments. And they are being eroded by Israel. And I'll go through exactly what happened this week to take those away. Make sure you get ahead of these things. Right. What else did they say? This means it will not cost the taxpayers a dime. Okay, so they've said the forfeited Bitcoin will be transferred over and it won't cost taxpayers anything. And it's Bitcoin. Brilliant. That's exactly how it should be done. Next thing it said, it is estimated that the US government owns about 200,000 Bitcoin. Sorry, no, you don't. About 100,000 of those are going to Bitcoin, which means you're going to have to get a bigger position. How do you get that bigger position? By following exactly what I said, not by printing money, but by strategically using, now you're in an austerity environment. Anyway, the 200,000 Bitcoin. However, there has never been a complete audit. So it's prepping you that we know about 100,000 these about to go back to Bitfinex shareholders, and there's only about 100,000 left, which means that China is the largest sovereign government that owns Bitcoin, because they do have 200,000. So America's going to want to catch up. Who's next? UK has got about 60,000 that is seized. The Kingdom of Bhutan has accumulated about 11,000 and is mining by using its hydro energy to make sure it gets as much Bitcoin. El Salvador's buying one every day for about 6,000 Bitcoin. Germany sold its 50,000 Bitcoin and is going down the proof of weapons network rather than peaceful proof of work. And then there are those are the main sovereigns, and Ukraine has a bunch of them as well, which was laundered through FTX and even through Celsius as well. A bunch of the client Bitcoin was used in order to raise finance for Ukraine, because Alex Majinsky, who is facing his going down in May, was an Israeli agent that is also originally born in Ukraine, and made sure that some of those client assets ended up in Ukraine, and made sure that the co-founders in Israel are using their right to return to ensure that they're getting away with their crimes. And Majinsky was the guy that is now going to be trialed in March after stealing all the Bitcoin anyway. So the audit is, so they're basically prepping up. And then it says the EO executive order directs a full accounting of the federal government, of the government's digital asset holdings. Okay, so that's where we'll get full disclosure. Who's got the keys? Where are they held? Who are they entitled to? That will all come out. Now, obviously, that's where Harald Lutnick uses some crony capitalism to ensure that Bitfinex gets it back, which is the rightful owner. But otherwise, the government would have just forfeited it. That's what happens when you put your Bitcoin in storage that way. Right, next part. It said the US will not sell any Bitcoin deposited into the reserve. So those Bitcoin won't be sold anymore. Unlike the Biden administration that was selling them, and the previous administrations that were selling them, it will be kept as a store of value, which is what Bitcoin is, because it is proof of work. And it is not got a pre-mine, and it's not connected or controlled by any one individual. It's got a network of nodes. It's got the largest security behind it, and that is distributed around the world with no political affiliation connected to any one country. The reserve is like a digital Fort Knox for the cryptocurrency, called digital gold. So now it is distinguishing between what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is digital gold. It is a reserve for the other parts of the ecosystem, i.e. the proof of stake networks that are going to be doing stable coins, as I've always taught right from the beginning, if anyone's been a long-term follower of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Right, what else did it say? Premature sales of Bitcoin have already cost the US taxpayer over $17 billion in lost value. That's because they were auctioned off. Who made that money? The VCs that bought them. Oh God, I'm forgetting. Pantera Capital, I believe, was one that won the auction. And what's his name? The guy with the big eyebrows as a VC early investor. Why have I forgotten? Sorry, I'm blanking out on his name. Many of the companies that we invested in, he was really early investing. Anyway, there was Digital Currency Group with Barry Silbert, and then there was another one. Okay, it will come back later. Anyway, use the comment section. I'll remember it later. In the comment section, who was the guy with the big eyebrows that was early investor that ended up buying from the auction a bunch of the Silk Road Bitcoins in auction? And I remember he bought them for about $600, and then the price crashed to $300, and they're still there, I think. Anyway, so now the federal government will have a strategy to maximize the value of its holdings. The secretaries of Treasury, i.e. Treasury, not Federal Reserve, and Commerce are all authorized to, this is the important part the market didn't hear, to develop a budget neutral, budget neutral was the word, not tax neutral, budget neutral strategies for acquiring additional Bitcoin, provided that those strategies have no incremental costs on American taxpayers. Now, if you go out and you try and get taxpayers to agree to buy in Bitcoin, it will never get through. If you already have strategic assets and strategic reserves, and you can rebalance them in order to acquire Bitcoin, then it is tax neutral, and it doesn't cost the American people anything. Now, the assets that are held in reserves are significantly greater than any budget you could ever imagine. If you could get a budget, even Ukraine, even Israel has taken $350 billion directly from the American taxpayer. Obviously, it got spent back into the military-industrial complex to prop up the petrodollar and create violence all across the Middle East as a strategic element to prop up the dollar to push out the proof of weapons network. But Israel got $350 billion. There's more assets than that in strategic reserves. So even if you manage to successfully lobby for the entire budget that Israel gets, you still wouldn't have as much as the potential by doing it this way. And so the idiots that don't know how to read this thing were selling their Bitcoin because they're fiat thinkers, thinking, oh, well, I thought the government was going to buy a million Bitcoin, because they're short-term price manipulators, or they're on the wrong side of it. You've got to get with the program. There's not much time left. You won't probably have a job in 10 years with the way that artificial intelligence and robotics are going. We are in a a seismic shift in the world right now in this transition. You need to be preparing now. You need to be thinking long-term. You need to make the right moves. Okay. So if you're an idiot, then you would have been selling your Bitcoin into that, and we would have been accumulating Bitcoin Hard Talk people getting some Bitcoin under $90,000 again, and wherever it goes next. So it doesn't cost taxpayers anything, but this is a much, much bigger budget. And they'll be able to use Bitcoin as a strategic asset, and other countries then can do the same as we enter into these different type of operations. So we are crashing when people use Bitcoin. We're swapping the old assets. We're swapping the proof of weapons gilts. We're swapping the proof of weapons treasuries. We're swapping the gold contracts with paper exposure on top of it. We're swapping the seized ships of rich people. We're swapping gold that was confiscated and swapping it for Bitcoin, which is boycotting the occupation of the central banking proof of weapons network, slowly but surely. And then you can use stable coins in order to transition out of full reserve banking when the whole system breaks. The oppressors will use CBDCs. The other oppressors will hand over the industry to crony capitalists and allow those to become the PayPal mafia, stable coin issuers, that have companies like Peter Thiel's Palantir, which is using AI in order to kill people around the world, selling contracts to governments. Those will be the future stablecoin issuers. But anyway, we can create decentralized AI, just like we created Bitcoin, decentralized stablecoins, all the things that we can do as we transition and have a resistance against that ever more centralization. Anyway, the other beauty about this, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm speculating here. I reckon this could get passed without having to go via Congress. So you don't have the bank lobbyists like Elizabeth Warren, those that contribute to Operation Choke Point 2.0. And now Gary Gensler has gone from the SEC. We got the corrupt Federal Reserve agents that are, doing the bidding of the bank lobby. They may not actually get a say in this because it's not requiring additional budget. So you might be able to bypass Congress in order to achieve this. And so therefore it could start right away. Now, they're not going to suddenly announce we're buying Bitcoin, because that would create a game theoretical event that would pump the price of Bitcoin like crazy. They're going to be doing this in the less transparent networks. The less transparent networks required BlackRock. It required the banking system. It required the fiat currency proof of weapons network, so they can slowly accumulate. And obviously, because the Israeli lobby and the banking lobby, they'll make sure that they don't get Bitcoin direct like El Salvador. They'll make sure it's custodied in Bank of New York Mellon through a paper version of Bitcoin IOU through BlackRock, so that if those networks ever wanted to be weaponized against America, a globalist agenda could wipe that and rug pull them from the American people. And because they control the Congress, they can use those networks in order to get it through. Anyway, they can hedge against it. But the net result is this is probably a larger budget for America to push its Bitcoin strategic reserve than it ever would have been if you went through the route that everyone was selling, where you just say, get permission to buy 1 million Bitcoin or whatever it is. And this is in the Cynthia Lummis bill anyway. So you could do it through the Trump administration, and then you could get it through a bill, just like the Securities Act of 1930 lasted decades and decades and is still there today, just like the Investment Advisors or the Investment Company Act of 1940 is still there today. You can codify it through the Cynthia Lummis bill. So then even beyond the Trump administration, the strategic reserve asset goes through, and the Federal Reserve cannot use its lobby power to take it away. So still carry on. And even if that doesn't happen, the states can still do it, so that they can become independent as well and have a tool to protect themselves from the Federal Reserve as well. Anyway, this can now be strategically used in currency wars, even the dismantling of the EuroDollar and petrodollar. So if the EU wants strength right now, it would align with Russia, get cheap gas that can go into Germany. It would then negotiate and align with Ukraine, get its rare earth deal. It would then become a net exporter to America, make it important between BRICS and America, and it would build AI data centers, rebuild its manufacturing base, use its artificial intelligence within the UK tech sector, and it could use Bitcoin strategic reserves to free itself from the dismantling of the European Union and stop the European Central Bank, which is a conduit that is a Fed first policy. And when the ECB needs to be weaponized by the Bank for International Settlements to take down America through the dismantling of the Fed, countries can free themselves by buying their own Bitcoin strategic reserves. The Middle East can use their sovereign wealth funds to repurpose Bitcoin mining, and BRICS can use it in order to build a distributed network of global South that want to pull the fact that they've all been the victims of the proof of weapons network and decide that they'll work with their partners that have been building them, like China, rather than their partners that have been overthrowing them and killing their people, like America, from the Federal Reserve. And so they can then have power by using Bitcoin and harnessing it. We are just getting started. You are still early in this journey. Okay. Right. There was also a further quote. In addition, the executive order establishes a US digital asset stockpile. That means exactly what I said earlier. The stockpile is if you confiscate assets and shitcoins are there, put them in the stockpile. Okay, so now you've got a bunch of the shitcoin casino in the stockpile. They may have value. They'll dump on top of you. Kind of the model that happens with the pre-mine. America just confiscates some of the pre-mine so they can dump on you. And consisting of digital assets other than Bitcoin, and these are forfeited, so they're not buying them, and it doesn't include Bitcoin. Bitcoin can't be sold, but the shitcoins can be in criminal or civil proceedings. Okay, so they can confiscate the shitcoins, put it in the strategic stockpile, and if they want, convert it to Bitcoin that can't be sold, and then the Bitcoin can make up the strategic reserve as part of this strategy. So if you're American, get ready for seizures. The government is being completely harnessed, just like the SEC. The mafia network goes around to companies and finds them and make sure that if you're incentivized to pay the fine, and then they can pay to grow and grow and grow. And in the end, it's just a racketeering organization for, pretending that they're doing it for consumer protection. But now this is exactly how it should be done. This is really smart stuff. Every country, watch what America is doing right now. They are setting the protocol, the constitution for how to do this and free yourself from a central bank, but then make sure you free yourself from the technocrats as well. Anyway, but you just free yourself by doing it yourself rather than relying on your government. But we still need to leave somewhere. So hopefully they can use this in order to make sure that there's less violence in the world. Right, what else? It says the government will not acquire additional assets for the stockpile beyond those obtained through forfeiture proceedings. So they won't be purchasing. It just means that they won't buy or sell shitcoins, but it's the perfect way to do it. This is exactly how you do it. Exactly how you do it. And if you want to do strategic shitcoinery, then you can do it through the sovereign wealth fund, and you can say, we think it's strategic to have you over here so that we can get BlackRock to own your stake so that we can build the network and we can control a chunk of the network, because everybody fell for the psyop of transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake. But you can be smarter. You can benefit from that by using the stakes in order to convert to Bitcoin as part of this is getting into Bitcoin Wealth Builder territory that we'll be covering in June later this year. Just make sure you're a member of simondixon.com so you don't miss how to do these things. And I'll just share exactly how I did it and what the results were. Okay, so this is step one. You build your Bitcoin strategic reserves. Then you have a tool at the right point to end the Fed. How do you end the Fed? You prove that they stole all of America's gold. You audit that, and you do what they did at USAID. You show all the corruption. You stamp it out. You say you're taking on the deep state. You then audit it, and then you realize it's a bankrupt institution, a foreign occupation, and you take down the system if you choose. I'm not saying that's going to happen because the deep state doesn't want that to happen. But then you can reverse the violence behind the petrodollar. That's what they did with USAID, expose the corruption, reverse it, and the eurodollar, which is expose the corruption and reverse it. And we enter into this new world order that we are experiencing that I've been covering on Bitcoin Hard Talk. What do they need to do next in phase two? Well, next you need to implement stable coins in order to compete with banking. So you get your stable coin regulations. Then you probably use your strategic stockpile to control proof of stake. But if people are smart, they'll make sure that some of those stable coins, if you want to be a world reserve currency in the future, it will probably be taken over by AI and it will probably use Bitcoin. And then the one that exerts the most freedom rather than the central bank digital currency is the one that will be the future world reserve currency in a Bitcoin AI and CBDC world. So we continue to build the network like Lightning, where stablecoins can exist on top of Lightning through the Taproot upgrades. And then people can lock up their Bitcoin and earn yield on top of Bitcoin as that network grows by providing liquidity for decentralized stablecoins as well. All to come. We've got this all to build. We are right at the beginning of this transition, but we only have 5 to 10 years before I think AI gets really, really funky. So you need to get the stablecoin regulations, and then you can do an attack. Now, where is the Fed going to try and exert influence? Well, they're either going to say we'll do CBDCs, which means hand over the entire banking network to the Fed, or they're going to say we'll make sure that we control some of the stakes through our strategic stockpiles, or they're going to say let's control the stakes and let's actually align with the technocrat companies that are going to be the future stablecoin issuers as well. And so that lobby pressure will come from the third thing America needs to do, as I've always covered, the market structure side. That is, who's going to regulate who? Is it the Commodities and Futures Commission? Is it the SEC? How co-opted are they by the Federal Reserve? What about FDIC and the operator of the currency, the OCC? The Fed is going to want FDIC, OCC, Fed control of stable coins. And you as Americans need to make sure that it doesn't end up that way, because then they will co-opt the stable coins in order to create a neo-Federal Reserve and a neo-technocracy by harnessing all the artificial intelligence data that comes from all these audits, and use that big data as America transitions to a world of artificial intelligence, because they're retreating because China is winning the robotics war, and America needs to end all these wars because it's getting distracted because China's controlling the assets by collaboratively working with people rather than use the economic hitmen at the IMF that's destroying America's relationship with people based upon a unipolar world as we transition to multipolar. Strategic retreat, and that's what needs to be done in order to make sure that happens. So stablecoins next to protect them from the Fed, OCC, and FDIC. Ban central bank digital currencies. That's already been doing. And then you can build your sovereign wealth fund in order to make strategic investments to the companies that you want to be in your country. And that can be done based upon, getting strategic assets that build a surplus, or however it wants to be structured. Segregated cash flows. Why do you think America's negotiating rare earth deals? Because it's taking its final bit of neo-colonialism and trying to get as many deals to probably fund its sovereign wealth fund, so then it can start to use and maintain regional power to win the AI race in this world, in this 5 to 10 year transition that we're going to go through. And what are we going to do? We're going to build it all on top of Bitcoin and make sure it's decentralized so that it actually becomes bottom up, removes borders, removes the ability to tax, and allows us to enter into the world that we should have been in the first place, where essentially we have decentralized, geopolitically strategic Bitcoin proof of work that can harness in a world of peace if we choose. I know it's not going to solve anything, but fixed money fix many things in the world. We still need to change. How will it change humankind when we're not oppressed by a debt-based Ponzi scheme? When you are not oppressed by a debt-based Ponzi scheme and you're not deep in debt, will that bring out the best in you or the worst in you? How are we going to train this artificial intelligence online? If you're the worst version of yourself because you're in debt slavery thanks to inflation and the debt-based Ponzi scheme, are you going to be putting better content out there on social media that will be training our artificial intelligence, or is it going to be worse? These are the hard questions, but protect yourself with Bitcoin, and we can try and fix corporations and governments and sovereigns and central banks, but do it from a position of strength and freedom as well. And that's what I want for everybody. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Keep going. Don't fall for the psyops. Watch Bitcoin Hard Talk every week and share this with your family. Like, subscribe. Make sure more people get the message. I need your help. We got more people to say. I don't want this to be just a small group of people that are prepared for this because they're following the media, and the media is funded and corrupt as to spread the message that doesn't help you, but helps those people that are benefiting from the proof of weapons network. Okay. So now that we know that, now that we got that announcement, the next thing they announced is that we have the meeting today, which will be after Bitcoin Hard Talk. And what they did is they leaked the guest list. Now, I'm not sure if it's the actual guest list, it's speculation, but I was very proud of the Bank to the Future team that we had 7 of our portfolio companies that couldn't get VC funding, were crazy misfit companies, and are now sat around the White House because many of our investors contributed to their funding round and allowed them to become as big as they are. Now, some of them became companies that I'm not even strategically aligned with. However, it still made me feel good. And many of those are on our secondary market at Bank to the Future that are going to probably be going public in the Trump administration now that it has a more friendly environment. And just to give those names, to give shout out to the companies that Bank to the Future supported funding, and some of them are on our secondary market, and the team that helped get these companies to where they are: Kraken, Coinbase, Robinhood, Exodus, Ripple Labs. Don't like the direction they went in. But anyway, if it ends up that their corruption ends up with a load of stable coins based upon XRP, at least the Ripple Lab shareholders will benefit from that because they got 50% of those tokens. Bitfinex, which also ended up creating Tether, and Circle, which is the second largest stable coin. And then we've got all the chain people like the Ethereums, the Solanas, the Cardanos and Charles Hodgkinsons. And they're meant to be there as well. Anyway, just wanted to say that it's a wild industry. It's amazing to actually see. And it is a massively changing time. So America is setting the model. They got it right first, I believe. But it doesn't mean they will execute it right. It doesn't mean that the Federal Reserve won't sabotage it. It doesn't mean that intelligence agencies won't try and take out the leadership of this administration, because every time there has been a movement against the Fed, it has led to death and assassination. God willing, that doesn't happen. But I'm just saying that that is the normal pattern. So we need to be careful. And you know that if that ever happens, they'll blame it on Iran. And then they'll say, oh, yeah, we need to come after Iran and we need to go back into our old model. And we can destabilize the whole Middle East. And then Russia needs to fight. And then China strategically aligned, and Iran and Russia have a defense deal. And then they'll push China to, the Biden administration model where we were before. There is a country that may want to do that. We'll cover that more in the geopolitical section today. You need to make sure it don't. So we have had 5 states that have rejected their Bitcoin strategic reserve bill so far. They don't get freedom from the Fed. Hopefully it happens at the federal level, but I think things will change now with the sequence of events that are coming from today. So those 5 states, I don't want to miss them. They are not having freedom. They will come back, capitulate later, and have to buy at a higher price. Shame on those countries. They'll regret it and they'll come back. Seen it time and time again in my 15 years. 2011, 14 years of being involved in this industry, since speaking at the first Bitcoin conference and writing the first published book to include Bitcoin Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. But there are still 30 states that are trying, and it looks like Texas is making progress there. And there are many, many states. So the states will decide, and you should be engaging in that political process if you want your state to be able to free itself in this transition. Of course, the crony capitalism continues. Eric Trump, Trump's son, he came out and said, traditional finance better catch up with crypto or it will quickly become extinct. And of course, World Liberty Financial, the company that built on top of ETH, that has stable coins, that is around the table at the White House, that has DeFi hard forks top of Ethereum, that launched their own governance token once they wiped out the SEC, so the SEC doesn't come for them, and is probably connected to Trump's meme coins and pump and dump schemes that I warned you against, that have crashed about 70 or 75, 80% now. And we're involved in those sniper operations. And then his other company, his social network that's doing other TradFi NFT marketplaces and launching Bitcoin ETFs, of course, they're going to benefit from everything. So that Trump can hand over his legacy to his own companies, as all these people sat around White House fight to try and asset strip America of their assets as we transition to crony capitalism based upon a technocracy, as the PayPal mafia become more important than the Federal Reserve, depending on which direction it goes. A couple of other things that came out. crypto or anti-Bitcoin Peter Schiff said that President Trump has helped pull off one of the biggest crypto rug pulls of all time and calls on Congress to investigate it. Well, of course, you can agree with some of that because there was a lot of manipulation. I'm not sure who, definitely the people hanging around with Trump were engaged in that, but get used to it. This is the easiest government in history to follow the money, get ahead of the trends, and understand what's coming next. And in the post, it's pretty interesting. Peter Schiff, for the first time, admits Bitcoin is digital gold. That was after my debate. If you didn't watch my debate, I believe if you look at the comments underneath it, it's on my YouTube channel. The comments underneath it said that of all the debates with Peter Schiff, this was the first time when he didn't have answers and he kept going down crazier and crazier things. If you think I won that debate, leave a comment below and let me know. But after that, there was that switch in narrative saying that it is digital gold. Now, he refuted that and said, no, I was just talking about what narrative Trump might portray. But anyway, it was after my debate, so I'll take credit for it, whether I deserve it or not. You let me know whether I deserve that credit, and you can watch the debate and see how his narrative changed after it. So, of course, the globalist institutions that use the Federal Reserve in order to approve the ETFs and use plants like SBF and FTX and Majinsky and Celsius, of course, BlackRock is making sure that its fund have as much Bitcoin as possible. Now they successfully got the ETFs approved, and because they couldn't beat us, they had to join us. So BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, which is a lot more powerful than the US government, ended up with 50% of Ukraine, has been asset stripping assets all around the world, has ended up with all the voting shares in many of the companies through its ETFs and board controls and every other things. It is said that a Bitcoin ETF, ItBit, it is now going to be investing in its own Bitcoin ETF from some of its other funds. And so it's going to be allocating $150 billion model portfolio, basically to have an allocation in Bitcoin because it thinks it's an asset that needs to be in everyone's pension, which is a great thing for those that are in the pension. But unfortunately, you've got to hold it through BlackRock, which introduces the counterparty risk. And of course, they rigged the system to make sure that happens. Anyway, this is the first time that the world's largest asset manager is now saying that Bitcoin needs to be strategically allocated and is going around saying that there's risk off as well. So just to give you an idea of that, this inclusion involves basically allocating a small 1 to 2% of those assets to strategically buy Bitcoin via the ETF. But Satoshi saw this. He didn't make it proof of stake. He made it proof of work so that it doesn't matter who owns it. And you holding it in self-custody means that you get to opt out of the Federal Reserve System and the proof of weapons network that is perpetuated by globalist organizations like BlackRock. Right, so now the SEC has replaced out the corrupt Fed bidders, and we've got new leadership. All of the SEC lawsuits against many of our portfolio companies have dropped. And so the latest two to be dropped was the SEC dropped the lawsuit against Kraken and against Cumberland Mining as well. The SEC, which is being downsized because it's no longer doing, hopefully, I don't trust it, but hopefully the bidding of the Federal Reserve for these covert operations, the SEC is offering eligible employees $50,000 incentive to resign and retire by April the 4th. April the 2nd is when the strategic tariffs comes in play. April the 4th is when the downsizing. So we are literally witnessing the downsizing of the US government, the asset stripping of assets over to those that benefited from the Federal Reserve money printing, and the resignation of employees that's going to create a wave of unemployed into a world that's transitioning to artificial intelligence. Hence why the macro market was correcting. At the same time, the judges, they decided to rule in favor of Richard Hart from Hex. We covered that. No fan of that project, but anyway, the judge ruled in favor rather than the SEC. Not sure what the situation is with the SEC on that one. And the remnants of the proof of weapons network, like the IMF, they started to really drug some power, try to use some power to make sure that it uses and weaponizes its tools, which are slowly but surely becoming less and less powerful. As dollars will have less demand as we move to de-dollarization, meaning you can't be weaponized by the economic hitmen at the IMF and in order to create financial weapons of mass destruction that leads to death and destruction in your country. So anyway, it decided that it wants to show some influence against the global south, against the power through its dollar enslavement that it inflicted through Operation Gladio upon countries like El Salvador, and said the IMF demands that El Salvador stops buying Bitcoin as a condition for further funding. El Salvador got its final bit of debt because it didn't own enough Bitcoin. If it had owned more Bitcoin, it wouldn't have needed that $3.5 billion it had to take from the IMF. But the IMF incrementally said, right, I'll lend you 3.5 billion, but remove your Bitcoin as legal tender. El Salvador had to capitulate, but then it kept buying more and more Bitcoin. Now it's saying we won't lend to you again unless you stop buying Bitcoin. And El Salvador and Bukele can decide to continue its freedom and continue to buy more Bitcoin, and then eventually it can free itself from the IMF. If El Salvador caves and stops buying Bitcoin, then we know the IMF got to it. The economic hitmen won, and it could return it to covert operations like Operation Gladio, and then use network like its intelligence agencies at CIA, Mossad, and MI6 in order to try and create more and more war and return us to the old model, while the Trump administration is trying to win the AI race against China and asset strip America over to the technocrats. And so if El Salvador continues buying and does not take that loan, President Bukele has officially given the double, triple thumbs up to the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the economic hitmen and violence of the International Monetary Fund. If that happens and he keeps buying Bitcoin and never borrows again, the IMF is powerless. The IMF is dismantled. The IMF can be exposed, and it no longer has the power in order to exert the petrodollar and the eurodollar and the oppression of the global south, and BRICS can rebuild relationships and fight against the dollar and hopefully utilizes Bitcoin. But it doesn't matter what happens next. We'll just keep borrowing it. We'll just keep covering it. So El Salvador and President Bukele show the world how it's done. America, show the world how to free itself from the Fed. BRICS, show the world how to harness Bitcoin in order to enter into multipolar. And Middle East, expel, show that we don't need to go to war, death, and destruction. And if America ends the Fed, defunds the corruption of the Israeli government, then Israel has to get on with its neighbors, as we are seeing in the geopolitical environment, have a two-state solution, end the war with Ukraine, and enter into what you could call a fourth turning and a world of economic prosperity, with Bitcoin regulating the countries together in a movement that could just wave and usher in the next wave. And it may call me ignorant, but everyone called me ignorant in 2011. But instead, those that got on board ended up freeing themselves from the system. Okay. Now, what happened with the next bit of game theory? So I'm not sure if these rumors are true, but having known David Bailey for a very long time, I met him in China many times when he was working with China, and met him in America many times when he was fighting against Barry Silbert and GBTC that was a weapon that was utilized for Operation Choke Point 2.0 to steal Bitcoin from people, and supported him in that initiative. But he started to release little hints around there. He released the hints around the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, around the leaks by David Bailey that China is moving at rapid pace in order to build their strategic reserves. In the future, if China does it, this could be the groundwork for solving the problem of how do you create a currency 40% backed by gold and make sure that a country doesn't default and end up holding its gold in an environment where it can be audited and it can have multi-signature transactions so that everybody is incentivized to have nodes where you can't default and you have to engage in diplomacy rather than war. BRICS could use that and use Bitcoin-backed settlement layer in order to do that. We shall see whether that happens, but these are very, very interesting things if China sets off that game theory, and then BRICS can have a global south, and then we can have Lightning Network built on top of Bitcoin strategic reserves across the global south. Now the IMF is weaponless, and now the Federal Reserve may be de-weaponized by America, and America is no longer unipolar. And this is the game theory that Bitcoin set in motion. Lightning stable coins take down all these different things. It is the most interesting time to be alive in financial history. So what else did we have? We had different governments saying, hold on, Belarus president, Lukashenko, he came out and he ordered the energy minister of Belarus to start mining. He said cryptocurrency. Soon he'll realize there's only one currency worth mining, which is Bitcoin. You could control some of the proof of stake network by jumping up validators, but harnessing energy in order to mine some Bitcoin so that it can be strategically important in the future. And it doesn't have to engage in covert operations where interference from Russia and the CIA and the KGB to decide which puppet governments get in charge. It can build back its sovereignty and see where that goes. The quote was that he said is, if it's profitable, let's do it. We have excess electricity. Let them mine this cryptocurrency and so on. And so that's what he said in the video. We also saw there was a documentary this week from the Kingdom of Bhutan, a very small country with a very small population that actually has the largest amount of per capita Bitcoin of any government in the world. And it is it's building hydropower dams in order to mine Bitcoin, using incredibly innovative ways of making sure that its country has self-sovereignty and can build its new financial system built upon Bitcoin mining and repurposing energy in order to build itself and have its own industry. So it came out and it had a demonstration of how it's mining Bitcoin and how it's got the highest number of Bitcoin per capita in the world. And it showed a mining model that the Middle East could be using as a beta test, just like America could use El Salvador as a beta test. All of these different countries in the game theory can now use it as beta tests, build its settlement layers between, the Middle East can build a settlement layer between US and China or BRICS, which are both going to be engaged in AI races. And they could decide we're going to price our oil in some BRICS currency, some US dollars, some Bitcoin. And then they could be the ones that decide how to, take down the petrodollar, for example, and instead build the petro Bitcoin. Why not? This model can be utilized because we don't need to align with one country anymore. We can put the world into some kind of currency harmony where the game theory of prisoner's dilemma and defaulting from diplomacy and peace are no longer worth it, because we have got, for the first time, digital hard sound money backed by the largest distributed supercomputer that is not politically aligned with any one country, where the game theory and prisoner's dilemma of defaulting upon diplomacy, peace, just like Bitcoin, you can't default upon the rules because it is set up in a way where there is no way to default from that. Fix money, fix the world. In the meantime, you get to front run, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. And that's going to do it for episode Bitcoin Hard Talk 73 for the Bitcoin section in part 1. We're now going to run through the second section, which is the macro section. So if you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor. Get this out to as many people. We'll break this up into 3 videos if you like watching just one part of this. But if you're like me, I will try and make this so you can just in a few hours have everything you need rather than wasting hours and hours and hours going through all the different places. You can get it all, and then you can prepare to transition to a world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDC. So do me a favor. On this video, if you're watching a recording or live, put a comment below. Help my algorithm. Put the like. Give me a like, a subscribe. Hit the bell symbol. Hit all. Help me get past 100,000 subscribers. Follow me on Rumble in case that goes wrong. Get a membership to my Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal for free, simondixon.com. And maybe you can also subscribe to my podcast so that you can download this on the move, and you can do it with no extra time. You don't have to watch this. You can do it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. All those links are around you. Please share that and get more and more people involved. I'm going to repair my voice, and then we're going to go dive into part 2 this week in macro. Okay, so I explained in part 1 this week in Bitcoin what is happening with the White House meeting and the model that could set a game theory that could change the world. And people are selling Bitcoin because they just wanted to be impatient and make some more dollars. Those will be the people that will be on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network. Who's going to be on the right side? Well, owning more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, while we watch the macro environment transition to this world of AI, Bitcoin, and CBDCs. So the proof of weapons network that requires more violence to exist, that is perpetuated by the European Central Bank, that was a construct that was really created after World War II, when Germany was split in two. We entered into a Cold War. We had the takeover of Russia from World War I, where Russia was replaced by the Marxist, communist Soviet Union. And then we had World War II that set the New World Order. And that New World Order was based upon Bretton Woods, where all currencies were converted into dollars, and then dollars was converted into gold. And then that was defaulted upon in 71 after the Fed Proof of Weapons Network created the Cold War and the Korean War and the Vietnamese War and the fake war on terror in order to get America in $36 trillion of debt, and to the point where it is right now. And with the fall of communism, just like Britain fell when the Bank of England occupied Britain and transitioned over to America, and the Soviet Union fell, and there was a resistance by Russia to expel all the oligarchs, turning Putin into essentially the enemy of the world, when he arrested all the oligarchs and stopped the Westerners from nationalizing all the assets and putting them in bank accounts in Cyprus. And then they did a bail-in in order to steal those assets by the Federal Reserve Proof of Weapons Network. And then they took out Europe by creating the European Central Bank. And we had the sovereign debt crisis that followed from the Cypriot side, that then led to a takeover of all of Europe by the European Central Bank, so that the Bank for International Settlements, through its network of 157 central banks, could use the economic hitmen at the IMF and World Bank in order to destroy people's currencies, make them print money, destroy their wealth, and suck up, through a dollar milkshake theory, all of the world's capital into America to create wealth inequality, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and then eventually that implodes upon itself because all the world's capital is purchasing and lending to the US government, while the US government sucks out all that money through lobbying groups and gets it into the hands of the military industrial complex, the banking lobby, and all the lobby groups. And then that is perpetuated around the world through organizations like USAID and the National Endowment of Democracy. And that then goes back to bribing Congress and perpetuates currency wars and an environment of resource extraction in a neo-digital version of British colonialism and mercantilism, but you get to pretend by controlling the media that you're exporting democracy and civilizing the world because we are the land of the free at the expense of everybody else on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network. And if they resist against it with debt-free money, then those governments get taken out, as it did for Gaddafi, as it did for Saddam Hussein, who said that they're going to price in euros. He's going to price his oil in euros, and Gaddafi that said he was going to create a pan-African currency, and Iran that used Lebanon and various other jurisdictions to create a Islamic finance system that was not backed by the Lebanese central bank, that then required CIA operations in order to install puppet governments that then led to all the violence and all of the trickery. And then that money was used for US aid in order to fund fake groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda that were implementing American foreign policy, created the fake war on terror so that you could be tricked into thinking any resistance against it was called terrorism. And those groups were also confusing any resistance against the proof of weapons network. And then you had this system that we have today where you can create a civil war immediately by weaponizing religion and immigration and open borders to play the people against each other, take away people's freedom of speech, enter into a surveillance state so that you can enter into communism on the blockchain through a central bank digital currency. But fortunately, in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto created proof of work, and we get to reverse the chain together of the proof of weapons network. Well, anyway, the European Central Bank is gearing up to taking over a part of the Federal Reserve's proof of weapons network. The European Central Bank proof of weapons network is getting ready to print or create $800 billion of euros that will wipe out middle-class Europe in order to take over the reins of the proxy war that America created through the CIA and end up the death of more and more people if we don't stop this in motion right now and persuade our bought leaders and our corrupt leaders that that's not the way. Okay. So anyway, why are they doing that? Because the European economy is dying. The largest economy was Germany. The CIA implemented a NATO expansion to suck out as much money from Europe over to converting into dollars to prop up the EuroDollar so that it could then be invested in the military industrial complex so that America could push the demand for dollars through the EuroDollar system. And then that would be invested back into treasuries so that the ECB could be weaponized after it created the European Union and make sure that the whole of Europe becomes Fed first to get more corrupt money out there. When that then led to America decided, let's take out Europe, they blew up Nord Stream pipeline, took away the cheap gas that Germany needed. And when it took out the cheap gas, said, you can buy it from us, but it's going to be 100% more expensive. And so that created a recession. And then through their network, they said, turn off all your nuclear power, turn off all your energy, and go for clean energy. And then that led to a dire recession and open borders that led to all the psyops because America started killing more and more people. And then that led to more and more refugees coming in. And then they can enact a civil war as soon as they choose. That is the model of the proof of weapons network. So Europe has now recognized we've been played. We got played like a fiddle. And those that are connected to the deep state are still doing another version of the Federal Reserve's deep state policy. And there is a resistance against that to say, why don't we normalize with Russia and get our cheap oil again and work with Ukraine and say, we'll work with you to help build your rare earth minerals, and then we'll become a net exporter and then export to America rather than being a Fed first policy through the ECB. They are deciding, no, let's do what America does. Let's stimulate our economy to weaken the dollar and strengthen the euro by investing in war and rebuilding our economy and rebuilding our manufacturing base by ramping up NATO. Maybe America can leave and we can suck out all that money, confiscate the 350 billion from Russia, and invest it in the US military industrial complex, the UK military industrial complex, and the Germany military industrial complex, and stimulate our economy on a debt-based Ponzi scheme that will make the rich richer and the poor poorer. So middle-class America and middle-class Europe will get wiped out if we allow the ECB to implement this strategy. Okay, so there has been a clear activation of the Euro proof of weapons network away from the EuroDollar and away from the US dollar proof of weapons network. Now, what do they need in order to exert this? Well, they need to do a stimulus based upon war. And so immediately the ECB comes out and does another rate cut. So we got our 6th rate cut in the cycle of the ECB. I think it's down to about 2.5% to try and stimulate debt so that banks can create more credit, so that we can have more inflation, so that people can be deeper and deeper into debt, and then we can pull together as much money for NATO so that we can suck up as much money out of the system and build the Euro proof of weapons network further. Now that the US has decided, because Russia won the war, we need to dismantle the petrodollar and the EuroDollar. Okay, so we had announcements this week that there is $800 billion incoming for the European EU war machine. War is the new EU QE. That is the new paradigm. War is a stimulus. And that will be pumped into stocks of the proof of weapons network, and the banks will benefit. And so therefore, those that are deep in debt will get wiped out, and those that are benefiting from crony capitalism, as in America, will have the same in the European, the ECB takeover. Right. So what are we seeing right now? So last week I said that Zelensky will be in the White House. And if you remember what I said last week, expect an escalation where there will be some kind of event that means that Trump can default upon giving any money to this, but set up a story where Europe can come along and build their own proof of weapons network. And you need some kind of event that will trigger a massive transition so America people can feel like we're America first, we're MAGA, we're the peacemakers, but US still gets the money because they produce F-35 jets, and they're producing parts of the AI and all the other things that Europe is being transitioned away from. So that will be a recollaboration of the EuroDollar to weaken the dollar and strengthen the euro so America can rebuild its manufacturing base. And that is what the event that we saw when Trump started arguing with Zelensky. If you watch the whole thing, I think I'll go through that. I'm not going to go through that now. I'm going to go through that in the macro section, why the first 50 minutes were different and why J.D. Vance was installed in order to make sure that argument happened so that we could have the theatrics that led to America feeling like they're the peacemakers and Europe being the war makers and just recollaborating the EuroDollar from the deep state. Anyway, I'll go through that in the geopolitical section. Let's stick to the macro side. And so the EU Parliament basically were seeking to revoke Hungary voting rights in the European Union. Why? Because they were saying you are pro-Kremlin, which means that you are Hitler, and therefore you don't get to overrule the war machine because we want to steal Russia's money and we want to get all that money in the EU war machine. And we are doing the bidding of the ECB, and we've got all our lobby groups to please. And so because you're not part of that, you don't deserve to have a voting right. And so that is what EU is lobbying for right now. So the Prime Minister of Hungary, Orban, who has been against the EU Proof of Weapons Network, basically the EU came out and said Orban wants EU money, but plays by Moscow's rules. Time to choose. Whereas he's going for diplomacy like America, saying it makes a lot more sense to work with Russia. And this was a CIA operation anyway. This is America playing us to destroy our economy. He gets it. He's willing to say it. And so EU saying, no, you're not allowed any voting rights. And we're gonna weaponize the media in order to say we are saving democracy. That's the game anyway. So what should they do? So for the UK and EU to rebuild their capital markets, they need inflow of investment. You can go two ways. You can do the war machine proof of weapons model and build a wartime economy in order to recover. But what they should do is they should choose the peaceful way, which, as I said, I've said it time and time again, which is normalize with cheap gas from Russia rather than buying the expensive gas from America, because it will destroy you and you have no choice. Work with Ukraine and Greenland. Don't let America steal those from you, and work on actually building something. Now you got cheap gas and you can rebuild a manufacturing base. Then you can do the exploration of the key minerals that are required for the semiconductor chips that are powering the artificial intelligence. And then you can actually have an economy rather than dying because you're buying expensive gas from America and you're rebuilding just on the war machine, which will wipe out middle-class Europeans. And then you'll have to do a pivot just like America is doing right now, because you'll be wiped out by the numbers and the maths. And the numbers the media are telling you about the situation are just completely unrealistic. And so that is your way to having a future. And then you can build a manufacturing base to mine some Bitcoin and build strategic reserves and get rid of the European Central Bank. And you can kill that, and then it will stop having a Fed first policy as well. And you can choose peace with using Bitcoin proof of work, as I covered in the Bitcoin section, if you choose. And then you can also do what America's doing, utilize stable coins in order to take out the fractional reserve banking system in a controlled demolition rather than a financial crisis where the ECB prints and takes over industry. And already the dollar is starting to weaken initially as this plan rolls out relative to the Great British Pound and the euro. So it is already playing out. Now, it is a very hard thing to achieve. So you better get your strategy right now, but you're choosing the wrong strategy. But this may just be a tactic to get to negotiation. And hopefully there will be a desire, because America's interest is to do peace with Russia right now. And so if Europe can align with that, then we could end up where Europeans don't need to be sacrificed in the proof of weapons network. But anyway, as it currently stands, the ECB is getting their way, and we're getting Europe-led death and destruction, which will do exactly what happened to America, and that will have to lead to a strategic retreat. But at that time, it may be too late, and AI may take over, and only China and America have a piece in the puzzle at that point. So on the news of this war-led stimulus, immediately European stocks rallied, but German bond yields started to go up. So the cost of lending to the US government started to go up. But the stock market started to get ready for the stimulus. So the government needs to pay more to borrow, but stocks are going up, which means it's asset stripping, just like was done in America. This is asset stripping at the expense of the European people. They announced a large spending plan. They was announced publicly, and they said, and they had a meeting with Zelensky. I'll go through more in the geopolitical section. I just want to focus on the macro side right now. And immediately there was a change in government within Berlin. And so the inbound government is a neocon warmonger as well, so that they can make sure that the German people are rebuilding its manufacturing base, based upon war stimulus. What the US is doing right now is they're going for austerity. And that is what Europe will need to do, just as Greece needed to do during the European Greek debt crisis. Europe will take us down the same route because Euro is a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And the austerity measures that are being implemented in US to reverse this debt-based Ponzi scheme will be exactly what Europe needs to do if it carries down this path. So you got the model, just watch. And the model is what we are seeing. That requires a massive US weakening and tariffs in order to unwind some of those relationships and massive austerity. And that is what we're seeing. But in US, they're asset stripping and handing over the assets, as I said. And so what did we get from the Federal Reserve in the current environment as this tariff and reversing of the EuroDollar and petrodollar is happening? Well, the Atlanta Fed is now saying that we are projecting, in order to have some narrative to change it, Q1 GDP will be minus 2.8% growth. This is why people, and so Trump is saying this will be a temporary transition. It will only be a temporary transition if they build their Bitcoin strategic reserves and fade out the Federal Reserve. Otherwise, it will be a complete asset stripping of stablecoins over to the technocracy, and you need to be building your own Bitcoin strategic reserves to counter that as well. But a very large contraction is being experiencing right now. That's serious, minus 2.8% growth, and that's coming from the Fed. You can either believe it, I actually believe it, or it could be narrative to reverse policy. Last week, they were saying it's only going to be minus 1.5%. So by implementing the tariffs, we've got minus 2.8%. 2 weeks ago, they were saying it's going to be plus 2.3%. So this is massive changes in terms of outlook. 4 weeks ago, they were saying that America was going to have a growth of 3.9% through to negative 2.8%. So what does Trump do? He needs to counter this. And he's saying, right, while we're doing this, we need to get much more inbound investment to rebuild the manufacturing base. So Trump announced that there is, and he was very excited about this, a $100 billion investment from Taiwan into America's semiconductor chip manufacturing industry. And there was a reversing of Biden's CHIPS Act, which he said was being connected to diversity and no one could qualify it. And so instead, he is getting inbound investment from Taiwan through TSMC, which is the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, which is the most important company in the world for a world transitioning to Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. So onshoring that through 100 billion of inbound investment. Very good idea. And you can have a chip isolation in a regional power rather than a global hegemon power. So that is some of the things that are combating that as well. But again, all of this doesn't reverse the model, because what is he trying to do? He is trying to get the Fed to reduce rates to stimulate more borrowing in order to do more quantitative easing, in order to have more and more power of the old model. And so therefore, that's more wealth inequality. So don't be fooled. Make sure you protect yourself. And the way to combat it is to boycott your Federal Reserve notes, save in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, and have a long-term 5 to 10 year strategy so that you can outperform it whatever happens. Because either way, it leads to the same result. One is asset stripping to technocracy. And then all the rich people, if it gets too bad, they just go to Singapore and countries that have surpluses. Or it ends up in some kind of civil internal, and then they take down the Federal Reserve and you have a controlled demolition and a transition, but you will still need to protect yourself and benefit from it whatever way it goes. We have to have multiple strategies for dealing with governments, because the last thing we want to do is deal with the government. So immediately upon that announcement, China warns and comes out, because we're entering into the tariff war, And so there was additional tariffs placed upon China. That was responded by additional tariffs on American companies. And China had its own summit this week and said that it warns if war is what the US want, and by US, we don't mean US people, we mean American people that have been indoctrinated into thinking that they're suddenly going to be taken over by the commies, and there is a forever threat, and therefore you need to expand and do more war to protect yourself from it. And it said, whatever war you think, be it tariffs, be it trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. And so you're getting some of those counter announcements. China also decided that it would retaliate and imposed a 15% retaliatory tariff on select US goods. So immediately it was testing. Is this just a negotiation tactic? So it went to the World Trade Organization and said, this is in violation of our agreements. And then as he realized that, no, Trump is going to do this isn't negotiation tactics, as everyone was saying. And that led to the correction in the stock market because Trump actually imposed them on Canada, Mexico, and China. And so it then said, right, okay, we're not waiting for the complaint of the World Trade Organization. We're going to start doing our retaliatory tariffs as well, waiting for the April 2nd date when it moves to reciprocal tariffs. And we get wild swings based upon whatever the model comes based upon that. The mission to weaken the dollar is becoming harder because this is still strengthening the dollar in Mexican pesos and the Canadian dollar because this is having really big impact on those countries. Now, China manufacturers have built factories in Mexico, and Mexico is the largest exporter. And so this is destroying that manufacturing base. And so Mexico is caving. Whereas Canada is not caving and saying, well, we have diesel that you need for the trucking industry. So we'll retaliate through reciprocals and we'll align with the EU war machine rather than the US war machine as well. And so that is, the Canada is holding strong, China is reciprocating, and Mexico is caving. Those are the models that we are receiving right now. So you could see an alignment around America where Greenland, Canada, and EU align around this new bloc, and you have a regional power that needs then to go into a stronger power around it. And so how do you combat that? You get EU to become a war machine and do the suicide strategy, which is what we seem to be seeing and why the European Central Bank say, let's print them into war. Let's not allow them, and let's continue the narrative that we need to go to war with China. We need to save democracy because he's going to expand and take over all of us. And so April the 2nd is the key date that we need to watch for, and we'll keep covering it on Bitcoin Hard Talk so that we can get ahead of it as we transition to a world of Bitcoin AI and CBDCs. Right. So what is Trump's strategy to combat that? His strategy is to push down the price of oil. He wants to get the price of oil, which is currently around about $70 to $50. So the drill baby drill companies that voted Trump in are going to be wrecked by $50 a barrel. And the Middle East in OPEC, unless we can get the geopolitical negotiations, if Israel continues to escalate America into World War III, that causes problems with Russia, that causes problems with China, based upon the old model, then China wins the AI race, American companies get destroyed at $50 per barrel, and OPEC will try and make sure that they are not aligned with that strategy because Saudi and Russia want more expensive oil, and Trump's trying to get it down to $50 per barrel. So this is why, remember the video I did 2 weeks ago on the New World Order, the meeting in Saudi Arabia that is set to happen next week is going to be negotiating who's got the strength, who's got the weaknesses, who's going to serve gas here, who's going to serve there. And then the ECB could change the narrative because Russia won the war and BRICS had the alignment that says Iran can provide China with oil, Russia can provide China with oil, and India can rebuild by buying Russian oil and then sending it to Europe, avoiding those sanctions, and the same with the Iran route. So you're starting to see the next progress of sanctions is in trying to see what can be done around those trade routes. Why do you think the Houthis normalized and may end up opening those trade routes as long as the GCC say we will normalize with Iran? And then when we normalize with Iran, we can then have a two-state solution as long as Israel doesn't escalate, that doesn't want a two-state solution. And we can either go the war route or the peace route. That's what's on the lines right here. And so Trump is trying to get oil down to $50 a barrel. This happened during the initial war between Russia and Ukraine. When Russia invaded, Biden immediately went to go meet MBS in Saudi and said, please bring down the price of oil. But MBS didn't do it because they were angry that Biden didn't support them when the Houthis actually blew up some of the oil fields in Saudi. And America didn't sign the security contract. That's because they did an Israel first strategy, because Saudi said, we will do the normalization only if there's a two-state solution. And Israel said, you can't normalize, you have to sidestep Iran and have no two-state solution. And so we ended up with MBS pushing up the price of oil by contracting the supply that led to the inflation, that led to inflation is transitory, that led to the spike in rates that took down the banking system and Silicon Valley Bank, that led to Operation Choke Point 2.0, that led to the crypto banks being shut down, that led to BlackRock getting the SEC to approve the ETF, that led to 1 million Bitcoins being custodied, that led to BlackRock saying we can now have a position in Bitcoin, which doesn't really matter because it's proof of work anyway, that then led to the meeting today where we'll decide what's happening with proof of stake, led to the resistance movement away from the crony capitalism, that led to the real Bitcoin strategic reserve. I know it's a big puzzle, but anyway, it didn't work by Biden, but maybe Trump can pull it off. And that's why it is best to negotiate with Putin MBS. It's best to normalize with Iran. It's best to have a two-state solution so that Israel can be contained and it doesn't need to be a tool of CIA foreign policy to create death and destruction to prop up the petrodollar that is in strategic retreat. That's why you're getting all the escalation there. And Trump seems to be doing the narrative. We'll go through that in the geopolitical section. But by getting that down, it can lower inflation and it can persuade the Federal Reserve to lower rates, and it can pump another debt-based Ponzi scheme. And then you can fix it with the Bitcoin strategic reserves and stablecoin policy as well. So tariffs and low oil prices would essentially kill Canadian oil equity companies, which would be a financial weapon of mass destruction, to file upon Canada, which would give America a weapon to make sure it doesn't align with the European Union if it goes too far down the war machine and is no longer in America's strategic interest. Now you see why everyone needs their Bitcoin strategic reserves in order to fight against this. Well, immediately upon this anyway, we had a correction in oil prices. They're slightly lower on the news that OPEC Plus, which consists of Russia and Saudi, they said, and they made an announcement that they're going to be looking to increase production from April. Coincides with April tariffs. Coincides with just after the Saudi Arabia meeting. Have reached peak centralization because central banks took over, and that is why a few people have way more power than all of your democracies. But democracies is a crazy game to make you think you're all distracted with left and right fights. When the proof of weapons network is making the decision, it starts with the money printer, the central bank. It then goes through covert operations executed through intelligence agencies, and then it takes out the leaders and pretends it's exporting democracy as it transitions the world to peak control, peak debt, bankrupts governments, and implements a globalist agenda, which is one world currency, one central bank digital currency, one artificial intelligence, until Bitcoin created the resistance against it. So oil was down approximately, since this policy, about 10%. The peak was $82 of the year, and it's now playing around about $70, and Trump wants to get it down to $50. That requires cooperation with the cartel, and the cartel said that it will aim for the gradual and flexible return of 2.2 million barrels per day of oil production over the next year, over the next year and a half anyway. So it can use oil in order to combat any Trumpflation or Fedflation, as well as any Trumponomics, I guess we can call it, and Trump tariffs. So you can see that it's just centralization decision making, which is why we Bitcoin, because we don't have to bow down to these people that control all the strings as well. Okay. Remember, that could be combated by either Russia or Saudi Arabia. So that's why negotiation is the way. They could push oil to $90 a barrel tomorrow if they wanted. It completely depends upon the geopolitical negotiations and the current situation, and it would be in their interest to do that. And so this is why EU going down the proof of weapons network will take them down the same paths. And the only strategy I know of is to normalize between Ukraine and to work with Russia rather than work against Russia. Okay. And America has figured that out, but EU is being pushed in a different direction. Anyway, all of this higher oil as well could be used in order to push lower rates by the Federal Reserve. And why does Trump need lower rates? Because he needs to refinance the bonds. Because Besant said we're not reducing treasuries, we're not reducing the money supply. In fact, we are printing more. And so it doesn't want to reduce, it's going to refinance the bonds. But if the bonds are refinanced at a higher rate when they expire, remember, it's a debt-based Ponzi scheme. So you have to find more investors to pay off old investors. If you can't find more investors, then you need to you need to pay them a higher rate. A higher rate means that your debt financing increases as you roll over the scheme. So you try and get interest rates down so that you can refinance the Ponzi scheme at a lower rate. And over the next 3 years for the Trump administration, there is $7 trillion that needs to be rolled over. And they're going to increase that as well. So they need to get rates down. And so this is why the oil strategy and the rate strategy all become important. And essentially, the Trump administration is pushing the Fed into what could drive it into QE and could end the quantitative tightening that the Fed said they will be doing right now, that puts more, that essentially takes assets off the Fed's balance sheet and puts more assets on the Fed balance sheet. Or if you have your Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy and your stablecoin regulations figured out, and you have kept that away from the OCC, the Fed, and FDIC, then you could decide to issue a stablecoin backed by mortgage-backed securities and treasuries instead, and you could just end the Fed if you wanted. You could have a controlled demolition, and then you could basically have a lower tax environment because you're no longer charging interest on the money, which is what it used to do, and it can have a tariff-based economy. All of this is some crazy things, which is why markets are so uncertain, because it is a change of model in the new world order that we are seeing. Right. So in weakening the dollar and strengthening other currencies relative to it, if Euro gets this right, this could have an inbound investment out of lending to the US government and inflowing it into your own country, and your own currencies can be used in order to serve your own country rather than lending it to the US government in treasuries. this could create a stimulus in the countries that don't invest in treasuries. That is the dismantling of the EuroDollar and the petrodollar, and that could lead to an environment of peace. And that's the environment that we need in order for America to win the AI race when China could win it as well. And the Middle East and Saudi can sit in the middle. That is what's being negotiated in Saudi Arabia, as I think. Now, gold is still under $3,000, but more and more people that are in the TradFi market that haven't figured out Bitcoin, more and more central banks are repatriating Bitcoin. We've got the uncertainty of the Fort Knox audit and what results could be that. You could do a controlled demolition of the Fed the same way you did for USAID. That was a beta test, a lot smaller. The Fed is the elephant in the room. But in the meantime, gold is still under 3K, Bitcoin is still under 90K because people aren't following the money correctly and they're thinking too short term and trading because they're in a dollar mindset. And dollar mindset, a fiat currency mindset, is cancerous. Rather than valuing your wealth in Bitcoin and pricing things in Bitcoin and getting the truth. Okay, so at the end of the macro section, let's just review what we have seen in Trump so far. Now, firstly, remember I campaigned said you cannot have Holocaust Harris and Genocide Joe. They can't get away with genocide because it will lead to World War III and the status quo and the continuation of the petrodollar, eurodollar, and essentially World War III. So you have to go through Trump because Trump means change, and we call him out on what he's doing good and what he's doing bad. I said you need to release all the Epstein files, 9/11 files, expose the relationship with Mossad and the Israeli government so that people know the truth, so that you don't get fooled into World War III by being forced to go to war with Iran. That could drive the petrodollar in a return to the Biden model. You also build a Bitcoin strategic reserve, you expose the corruption, and then you move to an environment not of neocon, but you use the exposure of the files to expose the end of Zionism occupation of Congress that we know is so prevalent because those relationships were negotiated through the assassination of JFK, through what happened with 9/11, and is being perpetuated for more violence through the October the 7th operation. Okay, so how is Trump doing so far? Well, he is not exposing Zionism, and he is not reversing the petrodollar relationship by anything that he has done in his first 40 days. I believe and I hope that will change, but everything on that side of the petrodollar is still being forced towards war with Iran and World War III. But I'm hoping that this is just saving face, using leverage and negotiations to eventually make sure there is a two-state solution and we don't need to go to World War III and we don't need to go to war with Iran. So far, Trump has sent billions of dollars to Israel, which is why there was an end to the ceasefire and the covert operations, and the media was activated in order to make you think that this is peace, and all the, all of the Israeli funding that went to these covert operations to allow October the 7th to happen, even though the chief minister has already said that they implemented Hannibal Directive, which is where they use Apache helicopters to make sure hostages led to, rather than taking hostages, killing of their own people. All of this has now been admitted. We've had admissions from the hostages that have been returned that Israel killed their own people, and then they've been lying about it, spreading propaganda, saying they were strangled and we need to end phase 2. And Trump is pushing that narrative as if he is a USAID agent or Mossad agent or a stanch Zionist. Continuing what is required in order to make sure there is no peace, which is pushing the petrodollar, a return to the petrodollar. Anyway, is that Trump, or is that those that bought him in the administration? We have to follow the money to understand it, and we know that there is a strong Zionist Israeli lobby that is pushing for that war and the status quo. So he's continued the funding to Israel. He's allowed the land grab to continue in the West Bank by covering up for it and not saying anything. And so 40,000, I'll do more of it in the geopolitical section, in fact. But anyway, he's allowing the land grab to happen. And he is perpetuating the narrative that is moving away from peace and making sure that the ceasefire does not happen. He said that he would solve the Russia-Ukraine conflict within 24 hours. I knew that couldn't happen. But he did start the negotiations, which is a big point. He gets a net negative for what's happening in Israel, unless there is a behind-the-scenes 5D, 12D chess that many of the MAGA people like to say. But he is getting a positive, but he didn't do what he said. He didn't get it within Russia-Ukraine within 24 hours. So the Kellogg plan said we'll do another 100 days. But he did push massive, massive changes. Gets lots of points for that. Now, Europe is trying to take the reins rather than normalize with Russia. So hopefully in Saudi Arabia, it will lead to Europe also normalizing with Russia. Otherwise, Europe is the sacrificial lamb and will get destroyed as a result of its bad wartime stimulus. But we've still got 100 days. He couldn't end it, so he needed to hand it over to Europe. In an ideal world, we would have just ended up with peace. So it's not exactly what we wanted, but it's progressed, and he definitely gets points for that. That would never have happened under Biden. In terms of releasing and exposing the Mossad blackmail rings and the Epstein files that led to, the blackmailing of Clinton and the pretense that there is, the Palestine is getting in the way of peace. They blackmailed during the Oslo Accords to make sure that it doesn't happen. Exposing that, negative. The Epstein files were meant to be with us. They're giving every excuse under the sun, and they are covering up for Israel. Now, I said this might be this might be a strategy that they have two versions of the files. One that redacts everything to do with Israel, which they are releasing now, and one that unredacts everything to do with Israel. And if Trump needs leverage because he knows China will win, the neocon vision wins, the occupation of Israel, then this might be the leverage they need to undo the Zionist control. And you might get 5D, 12D chess. But maybe he's holding that to save face and do a controlled demolition. You know that if you get a genuine two-state solution, the GCC, and you stop funding to Israel, so far none of that has been happening. And so basically they are covering up for Israel and the deep state is winning. Trump gets a negative for that. He gets a positive because he has been coming after NATO. He's been saying, we're coming out of United Nations. And we know that NATO and United Nations were ways of propping up the US dollar proof of weapons network by funding wartime stimulus. Now, ending NATO is ending the EuroDollar wartime narrative and handing it over. That's a good plus. United Nations was set up where US could veto vote against, the Palestinian cause and blame all of the things that are happening, stealing all the resources in Africa, stealing resources in the Middle East and perpetuating war. The UN was a mechanism for allowing US to veto vote. It used its veto vote to always stop a two-state solution and Palestinian self-determination. And so by exiting UN, it is saying, we're not going to do that anymore. Now, whether that happens or not, that's a indication that they are willing to exit from the EuroDollar and petrodollar. So we'll see whether this happens. The executive orders came through. And he also exposed USAID, which is USAID, which is the construct that allowed the petrodollar to exist and was used to pretend and control all media to say that they're supporting democracy when, Zelensky and the previous leaders were CIA implants to execute that war through NATO expansion. So he gets positive for all of those, but we still got to continue. There is still an internal struggle. And I said what I always said, vote Trump, you'll get change. Here's what he needs to do. And we'll analyze credit where it's due, and will tell you when he's not doing it so that you can understand the psyops and position yourself where it doesn't matter what he does anyway. The reality is, in deconstructing the petrodollar and the eurodollar, a market correction is needed. He did deliver a market correction, but he is definitely asset stripping America and handing it over to the technocrats like Elon Musk, the PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel through agents like JD Vance. And there is definitely, a transition there, which you need to protect yourself from as well. But he has laid the foundation for end the Fed based upon today's meetings. He said no CBDCs. So the Fed can't have their hostile takeover of the dollar away from the banks and over to the Fed for full control. But he is definitely laying the foundation for Trump's company to control the dollar, or all of the AI companies to control the dollar, and the different stablecoin layers that can control the dollar. So we are replacing one evil with another evil, but this one is better than the old evil. And so we'll make sure that asset stripping it is. And that's what we seem to be seeing. But it will wipe out middle-class America still. Okay. He is dismantling U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. foreign policy was created by Israel through the Clean Break Memo. And the Clean Break Memo says you need to go to war with, Sudan, and in the end, you escalate an Iraqi war, and a Sudanese war, and a Libyan war, and a Lebanese war, and a Iraqi war. What else am I forgetting? Anyway, a bunch of wars, and then you end it with an Iran war. We are moving in that direction. So U.S. foreign policy in that direction is not changing. If you end up in war with Iran, then unfortunately, he has got a triple negative, and he ended up being fooled back into a Biden strategy, but he asset stripped everybody along the way. So U.S. foreign policy is definitely destabilizing countries. It is definitely leading to, that type of thing. And so that is where we are so far in the first 49 days. But it was absolutely right to vote for him. So, this is the right strategy. But you just need to make yourself ahead of it. So remember where we are right now as we move and transition into the geopolitical section. If you go to war with Iran, then it is still covert regime changes and more enemies for America. That is the IMF model. The IMF model is being tested, as we covered in El Salvador. The China model has been get people dependent upon China, but build them up so they buy more goods. The American model has been use the IMF to control countries so they don't compete with us. We need to keep an eye on that, because that is the construct of the multipolar world anyway. Overall, change is happening, and that was what was needed to avoid World War III. We just need to be aware of the psyops. So Trump has delivered change, and so far, net positive. What he needs to do, and the final part of the macro section before we go into geopolitics, and this will transition us in nicely, is he needs to avoid World War III. But I have noticed this week his narrative is Iran is next. And all of the events that we'll cover in the geopolitical section, which is making me think he is being tricked into World War III. And that is the importance of the unredacted 9/11 files, the unredacted JFK files, the unredacted assassination files. All of those are the tool, as it were, to make sure we don't get fooled into World War III. And so that's everything for this week in macroeconomics. And the final section in part 3, we're going to be going through this week in geopolitics. If you enjoyed the macro section, make sure you return to the Bitcoin section if you didn't watch it. And stay tuned for the geopolitical section. But I need a favor. I need you to help me get my message out. I need to hit 100,000 subscribers on YouTube so that I can be unshadow banned, get a blue check mark, and be reviewed by the YouTube team. Because what I used to say was what they considered conspiracy theories that needed censoring, but now it's being revealed as truth. So do me a favor, in case YouTube bans us, get over to simondixon.com, sign up to my membership portal. All the old videos that have been banned and the backups, they're all there, including a free copy of my book, the last video series, all sorts of stuff. Make sure you got the membership and I'll notify you of everything in case YouTube stops notifying you. In case I also have to publish somewhere else publicly, follow me on Rumble and help me get to 100,000 on YouTube by subscribing, hitting the bell symbol, hit all. And then follow me on X, where I publish uncensored content as well. Please do share this with anybody else that you think needs to be prepared for a world of Bitcoin AI and CBDCs. We need more people to manage the transition, because there is still a risk that war to Iran takes us to World War III, and there is still a psyop to try and get us there. So with that in mind, let's go through the geopolitical section so we can find out and get ahead as we transition to this world of AI, Bitcoin, and CBDCs. Okay, welcome to part 3 of this week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. We are now in the geopolitical section, which builds upon the macro section and the Bitcoin section. And we are discussing the transition from the US proof of weapons network that today is going to build a US proof of work strategic reserve, Bitcoin strategic reserves, as it hands over the reins of the violent Euro to the Euro proof of work, proof of weapons network. Right. What we need to observe at the moment in order to stay ahead is the dramatically different treatment of what's happening in the Ukraine, Russia, which is US-Russia proxy war, and the Israel-Palestine, and the different treatments. Once you can understand the difference in the two, we can understand where I think we're going based upon everything that happened this week in geopolitics. So in previous sections, I basically said and made the case that America and the CIA are handing over the Ukraine mess to Europe and basically trying to get what it can after losing the proxy war to Russia. The US basically needed some kind of event in order to allow that transition to happen. Zelensky visiting the White House was exactly that event. And my personal belief is that the event was complete theater in order to give that transition, and basically do what I said in the macro section was happening to place pressure on the EuroDollar system. You can go through the macro section if you haven't watched it. So what happened this week? So after last week's episode, Zelensky visited the White House, and basically Trump said that he would sign a rare earth deal. Now, he did his usual strategy that a deal has not been signed, but he does a humiliation ritual in order to get the leader sat to him in front of the press and PR. He loves press and PR, and just says something has happened. It's called in sales, assume the sell. He just assumed the sell, said it's happening in order to bully with Zelensky next to him that it is happening. There was no final rare earth agreement signed because it required solving what's going to happen with Europe. And so by that not being solved, and it also required solving that UK had already signed a rare earth deal and it had collateralized Ukraine's land by using the IMF, and that BlackRock has also taken over 50% of Ukraine. So all of those bits, a globalist agenda, a non-American first agenda, is interfering into that deal. So Trump tried to just assume the sell and make it happen, manifest it into existence, as he often does. That is what essentially led to that conflict. It was a press conference. It basically went on, if you notice, you've got to watch the whole thing to see the full picture, not just the clips. So it was going well for approximately 50 minutes. He was doing his assuming the sell. There was a bit of pushback, but it wasn't going in the direction to create carnage. So Peter Thiel funded Implant and Vice President Vance that is most likely the selection for the next administration, which is why all US aid is being exposed. They're saying it was the Democrat Party. It wasn't a US foreign policy. It was a Democrat. Now, Democrats are definitely more corrupted because the deep state definitely paid for more Democrats than Republicans. But Republican and Democrats both have Zionist control, but there is more neocon in the Democrats. And Trump is doing a pro-Zionist, non-neocon strategy at the moment. And so one of the people that has been funded by Peter Thiel, which represents Palantir, which is the AI military industrial complex that's executing genocide as a service and occupation as a service as a beta test in order to sell to global governments as we transition to the asset stripping of America, handing it over to the PayPal mafia, Elon Musk, using data and transitioning the economy to an AI economy and using stable coins in order to exert who controls that network. JD Vance is Peter Thiel funded, so he has to go through what is a Palantir first strategy. So JD Vance intercepted and changed it into essentially an argument. He also had people in the audience where the press were meant to be that said to Zelensky, why aren't you dressed in a suit? Which was, kind of taking it in a direction that led to gaslighting and this theatrical event where America get the right narrative because they get to say we're the peacemakers. Europe get to kind of take on the reins and say we're the war makers, we're still expanding democracy. And you get this humiliation ritual of Zelensky and the Europeans in the eyes of the Americans so that it's absolutely impossible to continue the CIA operation and make it look like it's those crazy European warmongers who are still deep state controlled. And America gets to retreat and dismantle the EuroDollar and execute its strategy. That's everything that came from that. So Vance did some essentially interference, gaslit, and led it into this crazy argument that triggered Trump. Whether it's all theatrics, whether it was a psyop, whatever it will be, and it led to all those crazy, and I was there, we all engage in some Jerry Springer drama with our floor to the mouth as we turn in politics into entertainment, which would be hilarious if it wasn't for so many people dying here. But we all get to share and we distract everyone from the Epstein files that was about to be dropped, and then they didn't get dropped because the FBI said, all right, we need to redact this, redact that, take out all the Israel stuff. And we still haven't received. They give us a little bit of what's already been released. And they redact what was already previously unredacted, which is hilarious. Anyway, I'll cover a bit more about that. Anyway, they gave the theatrics that we needed to distract us. But Vance, that is a Peter Thiel funded implant for Palantir, basically created the carnage. And this was, I believe, the event that they needed to hand over the US dollar proof of weapons propped up by the EuroDollar over to the European proof of weapons propped up by the ECB, and the strengthening of the war machine and a stimulus in Europe that is a temporary measure that can be wiped out through hiking rates when it wants to take down the European banking system, that could then wipe out the American banking system, that could then transition to a global CBDC whenever that is needed. So what does EU do right now? We get all of this narrative around we must help export democracy. Russia's about to take over the whole of Europe. We get the whole US aid funding old narrative. And what do they want to do? Well, they want to take the Russian sanction fund and they want to essentially invest in the AI part that they can't do. So they want to take Germany's military industrial complex, UK's military industrial complex, and the French military industrial complex. UK and France have the nukes to say that threat. Germany wants to rebuild its manufacturing base. They want to get Russia's money. Eventually, they have to normalize with Russia, but they want to confiscate that and make sure it does a wartime stimulus within Europe. And the part they can't do, which is the AI, benefits Silicon Valley and American military industrial complex, which is J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Palantir. And all that data goes back to Israel, and Israel wants to control all the data and take away Saudi Arabia's role by causing America to go to war with Iran, which would lose the AI race, win it with China, and Israel can just basically sacrifice America if it wants at that stage. Whereas hand over, the control of the Middle East over to Israel, where at this time, in order to win America's AI race, they need to hand it over to Saudi and the GCC. So that is the friction, which is why it is very concerning that there is not the same treatment of peace when it comes to the Middle East. And it is doing everything to perpetuate war, while at the same time it is doing the euro-dollar side. But that is because Israel gets its data, America gets its AI, and Europe gets to be the person that can say, well, let's not normalize with Putin, while America does normalize with Putin. And so Europe gets to be sacrificed dependent upon American gas, which is an economic disaster for Europe, but it stimulates through war. The long-term strategy I've already outlined. So the question is, was it real or was it staged? It doesn't really matter, but I just follow the money because either way it leads to the same thing. I tend to think a bit of real, a bit of staged, but we know that this whole war was an American war in order to get more money into the US military industrial complex. We know that. Weaken Russia, get Europe dependent. So Trump is there to say, we've been ripped off. 350 million. You got 100 billion, sorry. Biden's crazy. Blame it on Democrat. He gets to do that whole narrative. Follow the money, and you know that it went into Ukraine corruption and American corruption. And we know that that was part of the strategy to prop up the dollar. So, just US foreign policy as normal, as drafted by the Clean Break memo. WikiLeaks already told us the whole truth. I've published all the WikiLeaks stuff. If you follow me on X, all the documents that said they knew about it and what the result would be and NATO expansion. But is it feasible, like this event, Zelensky having this major argument with Trump that was so theatrical, is literally going to change? It was a massive event that changes the course of history forever. Is it really possible that was real? Well, maybe hard. I don't know. Anyway, but I tend to think it was theatrics. We know that Trump loves PR. He is a PR man, and that is his model. Manifest things into existence, assume the sell, do it in front of the press, bully people into submission. And that was the strategy he's been doing with all leaders. But remember, he did promise that he would end this war. And there is an element of he hasn't been able to succeed it. So while he's saying, I will talk with Putin, he hasn't actually done a meeting with Putin. And he doesn't actually have the cards to end this. And so maybe this is just handing over the reins. We'll play peacemaker. I get to say that I did peace, and he deserves it for what he does, because I don't think anyone else could have done it. But because Russia has won the war, we need some kind of theatrics in order to achieve this mission. You put it all together. It may be whatever chess is needed. That ties into, kind of the euro-dollar model. And there is a problem. The dollar is strengthening, and that needs to be weakened. So go through the macro part. But that also involves destroying the economy. So we started to see the correction. And so he's saying short term, but you need the monetary reform in order to get to the other side. So you need Europe to kind of be the sacrificial lamb in order to get the same stimulus as you make this transition. So this may be more destroying Europe because Germany has no cheap gas. and you get to sell gas to Germany at expense. So it gets to come out of its recession by wartime stimulus, but it's not long term. So that could lead to the dismantling of UN, which is why European countries need to build their Bitcoin strategic reserves, as we covered in the Bitcoin section. But here's the cold, hard reality why Russia is run, despite what they'll tell you. Follow the money, and it's obvious. So Ukraine is running out of soldiers. That's a reality. Right, so we know right now that Russia has all the cards. Any deal is going to be on Russia's terms, and he needs somebody to blame that for. So by throwing Zelensky under the bus, when we know it's going to be a bad deal, at least he can say, well, it's because of Zelensky, right? So that saves face in that part. This is really a very big US strategic defeat. But you get in the PR to look like Nobel Peace Prize type stuff. And so that's why I think it all happened. The problem is that in this negotiation, and why it is a defeat, is because Russia's economy is stronger than ever, despite the fact that the media won't tell you. EU are still pushing the narrative. They either don't know it, or they're corrupt, or both. But because of that, Russia couldn't actually get its sit down with Putin. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen. And Trump couldn't actually, get the meeting to happen. It was a phone call rather than a meeting. It was meant to have happened by now. And so staging a fallout would be a really good way of doing this. Now, that might be by one person. It might be by all people. It might be by a fraction of some people. We don't know. I'll never know. But we know from the WikiLeaks that it was a CIA operation. And we know that this is the Moscow winning over Washington. Now, US could get a stake in the natural resources. That allows to say to the MAGA crew, we're getting our money back. That satisfies the MAGA people. That could actually go into a sovereign wealth fund as well, as we covered in the Bitcoin and macro section. That could be used in order to control some of the proof of stake networks and follow that strategy. We don't know. That's just speculation. This whole strategy could have been supported by UK rather, who has Brexited. Could be supported by France as well, because those are the two military powers. And those were the two that visited before the Zelensky meeting. So that might be part of how it is. But the reason and the excuse that we're given for Ukraine to take over and the deal to be sabotaged is that Zelensky wanted a security deal. Now, we know from Russia that this was about NATO expansion. So a security deal from America is just not possible, because that doesn't solve the problem that solves a war. And so we're allowed to say, well, Zelensky will only sign the deal if there is security in it. And so that was the theatrics that we were watching. Now, one way to get a deal, we know that leads to US companies and US people extracting mines in Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure that is unacceptable, because Zelensky wants security deal. And the whole reason this happened was because NATO expansion. So the deal could lead to further NATO expansion if the neocons get their way. And while Trump is not a neocon, he doesn't know what will happen into the future. So Russia needs some kind of guarantee. And so it doesn't all make sense. It's happening in Palestine. And so essentially this deal means let's use American people as human shields.
Sorry.
And so it doesn't fundamentally work based upon the monetary flows rather than what people are saying. And so that's why I think Zelensky was pushing for security. That's why I think Vance led it into an argument. That's why I think Trump escalated it into chucking out Zelensky from the White House because the deal just couldn't be done. And that's why I think we ended up with the war stimulus, And that's why I think we're not getting normalization with Russia on the European side, but we are getting on the American side just by following the money. Again, I could be wrong on some of these things, but that's what makes most sense to me. Because the sticking point for Zelensky, for America was the minerals deal. And then he said, but if we don't get security, then there is no minerals deal. And he wanted guarantees. But that doesn't solve Putin's side of the deal. So we'll see. But the deal was rushed and it was assumed to sell. And it was a humiliation ritual when you watch the whole thing. And so it ended up with the kicking out of Zelensky, saying you're disrespectful, you're rude. He went out in the White House. And then I don't want to go through all the details because you probably watched them all. There was lots of back and forth with everybody arguing and one person apologizing. And then Europe coming in and showing their strength and everything. And then it led to a series of actions, which, remember what I've always said. These actions are about taking political events and reversing the funding because America is in strategic retreat. And so this led to Trump saying that all US aid is off for Ukraine, which is the goal. That's good for America first. Trump then comes out and warns that Zelensky, warning him, Zelensky either make a deal to end the war, or you fight Russia without the United States, which is essentially saying, EU, you take over. We're not going to spend any more on NATO, and you are dismantling NATO, but trying to get it where the European money comes back into America as well as Europe. And so UK Prime Minister Starmer immediately came out and showed a show of solidarity with Zelensky, invited him into UK, and then immediately followed up with a show of solidarity with the European Union. Immediately got it where UK are clapping for you. We're exporting democracy. Piers Morgan continues the narrative. You get all of that as well. But the US get to be real at the moment. So all of the US Republicans and podcasters and influencers, they get to say, why don't you want peace? This is going to kill more Ukrainians. So we're getting truth on one side, but that's where we are right now. Now, Norway, who has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, because it exports so much natural gas, it came out and said, we're no longer going to allow US, which has one of the largest marine fuel companies, announced that we're now going to allow US to use. Sorry, I'm not a shipper guy, but sorry if I'm getting the wrong language here. But we're going to now getting towards the end of this. I've got one more conflict to cover, and then we'll be getting through to the end. We're going to longer allow US companies to refuel. That was a real tongue tie for me. Their Navy vessels after essentially Trump's treatment of Zelensky. So you get a real shift in the narrative. UK then comes out and said, we're signing a 100-year military and financial pact with Ukraine. We're going to be sending $3 billion annually until 2031, until that gets renegotiated. Putin then comes out and said, don't worry about the rare earth deal. You can do a rare earth deal with Russia because Russia has lots of rare earth deals, and US can do a deal with us, and then Europe can do the rare earth deal with Ukraine as well. It kind of emphasized as well in the announcement from Putin that their rare earths are significantly greater than Ukraine's. It also emphasized that 50% of Ukraine's rare earth are in Russia-occupied territory, and we pretty much know what a peace deal will look like. I'll give you some ideas of what I think it is. But again, the smartest move for EU would be to position itself as an exporter and do what we discussed in the macro section. We talked about the Hungarian prime minister as well. Viktor Orban, he came out and he called for the EU to enter into direct peace talks with Russia. And the EU then held an emergency meeting with Zelensky there, and that was held in London to show the importance of the European Union, even post Brexit, that there is an important relationship there. US came out and said that it would plan sanction relief for Russia, reduce sanctions, and then Elon Musk, which essentially is the technocrat that benefits from all of this. Elon Musk is going to be able to, he came out and said on X that Zelensky wants a forever war. So now the neocon language is being exposed, which he's never exposing Israel because Israel wants a forever war with Iran. But now he's saying Ukraine wants a forever war and a never-ending what they're calling a great meat grinder. So that keeps coming out. We're seeing this meat grinder where Ukrainians are being sacrificed, which absolutely is the truth. But they're not using that language for the petrodollar sign and the Israel side as well, even though it's true. So look, just see, if you haven't figured out that this is just one big PR machine to change the PR narrative to meet strategic goals, then you can see through the Israeli psyop and everything that's happening. And so Elon Musk comes out saying this is evil. It is evil. Lots of Ukrainians are dying. Russians are dying as well. But Russia clearly has way more people and an economy that can carry this on for longer and longer and longer and fight till the last Ukrainian. And so that's the European mission. And that's the issue we're getting right now. So this week we saw, and even today and yesterday, Russia continued targeting Ukraine energy infrastructure, which is going to create more and more problems. It's going to be more and more expensive to rebuild. And then they can sell more and more weapons and then allow more and more of that to happen. So the deal gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people die based upon the EuroDollar proof of weapons network transitioning to the EU, ECB, Euro proof of weapons network. Trump then comes out and is threatening large-scale sanctions on Russia, which is earlier he was saying we'll do sanction release, and now he's saying we're going to do more. So we're getting confusing narratives, but basically saying until the ceasefire and peace deal is reached with the Ukraine, we're getting this back and forth confusing type of thing, because unfortunately US don't have the cards when it comes to this one. They lost. So increased sanctions won't do anything. All of those trade routes have been figured out. Russia is a stronger economy than it was, and it had a weakening process. But the sanctions were combated because it pushed it closer to China, and that BRICS corridor formed stronger and stronger than stronger. So now Trump is coming out and saying that the US will not defend NATO. That was today, countries, if they do not pay their fair share. What does that mean? Confiscate Russia's money, stimulate through war, make sure the AI stuff gets into Palantir, and put some of it, US doesn't need to pay for it. You now pay for it, and the ECB does the wartime stimulus, and US gets to do its weakening of the dollar and strengthening of the euro. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and admitted on national TV that the Russia-Ukraine war is in fact just a proxy war. And it is a proxy war between two nuclear powers, which is US and Russia. So we're now just getting the admission of it. And the retaliation immediately after Zelensky was thrown out was that US cut all intelligence agencies sharing and halted all of the military aid to Ukraine to push the EU stimulus package and the ECB $800 billion stimulus that will wipe out middle-class Europeans and lead to more inflation. They'll try and combat it with oil, as we covered in the macro section. But that is what is pushed, and that is where the geopolitical section, the geopolitical side is taken. Now, for Ukraine, that weakens precision weapons and various other things, but it doesn't really matter. And unfortunately, Europe is going to escalate this. And it is just about taking that $1 trillion, $800 billion of stimulus and $350 billion, and then they'll just do the same deal they would have got done anyway. So remember that when the peace deal was going to happen between Ukraine and Russia before, it is probably identical to will probably be negotiated right now, minus, we've now got more land giving away, more resources given away, more money being spent, more destruction, more people killed. And so the deal just gets worse and worse the longer this goes on for, which is why Russia can just continue this and continue this and continue this, and it will just lead to a worse and worse deal for the corrupt people that are benefiting from it. The peace deal will likely look exactly what was negotiated before. What was negotiated before is identical to the one that happened. And what happened? Boris Johnson was sent from UK by US to make sure peace is not negotiated during the Biden administration. And that then persuaded Ukraine out, which also has a CIA implant, to make sure that he can pretend get more money, but not do a peace deal. And it has been disastrous. And it was just a US operation to see if they could win, and they lost. So what is the deal likely to look like? Well, this is what it looked like before. This is what was negotiated before. Security guarantees by each party that is probably implemented by the United Nations peace people that go in and find neutral peace troops to maintain peace. That is what has happened before. That is what will likely happen right now. It was going to be a drawing of the lines based upon the current occupations. The occupations have increased. That is what it was before. That is what it will be now, but with more land. It was also NATO neutrality for the defined countries in the European Union to have that buffer zone that separates NATO expansion, getting closer to Russian borders. That is what it was before. That is what it will likely be right now, but those borders are further and further over to the east as more and more of the West is occupied, with more occupation of Russia of those rare earths. It also is trade agreements, and that is between the EU and the US that are now fighting over sanctioned Russian money, where the military expenditure will happen, who's going to be providing energy, gas, and oil exports, and who doesn't get to do it to who, and the trade agreements over rare earths. That is what was being negotiated before. That is what US stopped. That is what UK and Boris Johnson came in to stop. And that is what Zelensky ensured wouldn't happen. And that is why Russia has moved all of the deals in their favor. And we're still going to probably end up with the exact same deal that could have been done before. And this is why the European Union thing is a joke. You can spend 800 billion. You can take 350 billion, but it doesn't change the dynamics of it's just going to lead to more and more and more and more getting a worse and worse deal. The longer this goes on, the more it is in favor of Russia, and the more people will die. That's the tragedy of the whole situation. The current statistics, when the war started, Russia was 22% debt to GDP. Today, it is 15% debt to GDP. So the economy is better off than before the war. Now, there was rough in between. The Russian economy has grown from its sanction position to $2 trillion. Russia's producing 20 weapons for every US weapon that is being produced right now. So it can go 20 times larger replenishment of supply. Those weapons can no longer go to Ukraine, and Israel wants them to go to fight the war with Iran, leaving America without its own protection, with Russia going 20 times larger. So literally, this is not America first. The longer it goes on, the worse that situation gets. Russia already has trade agreements with BRICS and China and Iran and the global south that through controlling the price of oil as an OPEC plus member, it can just put the dynamics in its favor however it wants. It can circumvent any type of sanction that is thrown. Sanction doesn't work anymore. And China is dependent upon that. And the further that goes on, the stronger China gets in the AI and robotics race, while America is weakening in that side because it's deploying too many resources into death and violence and a potential another forever war. So America has everything to lose if it doesn't end the Israel first policy and end the occupation that's happening within America by Israeli Congress as well. Or it's Israel First Congress, sorry. This would lead to further, what the sanctions did is it led to further integration by Russia across the global south, and it didn't lead to the isolation, which was the original strategy that happened in North Korea. So we have two choices right now. America is no longer neocon on the Russia side, but EU is. But America is still neocon on the Iran side because there is all the blackmail rings that still exist that aren't being exposed by not revealing the Epstein files as well. And so there is a Zionist path, and the neocon has switched from America to Europe. And that's why the proof of weapons network and the capital flows will help us understand where it goes as we analyze more and more and more. EU first should want integration with Russia, as I said, but it's not going for that right now, but it will do that in the end. But the deal will be worse and worse and worse for Europe. So anyway, the announcements we got on that side is that Putin came out and said that he would help US President Trump to broker nuclear talks with Iran. And because now Iran is a member of BRICS and it pushed that relationship together. And what are we getting? The next narrative that happened just today. Trump was giving his Q&A with the press, and immediately he was pushing Iran's next, Iran's next, Iran's next. And so everything is being pushed to that. That's why we need to make sure that we understand what's happening in the second conflict. So the US envoy, Steve Witkoff, he headed over to the Middle East. And this is to advance moving into the second phase of the key deal negotiations between Hamas and Israel. The deal was that it would have 6 weeks in deal one, and it would move to phase two. Phase two means Israel needs to retreat. Israel needs to negotiate the two-state solution, and Israel needs to accept the plan that will be put forward by Egypt and the GCC. Egypt and the GCC put forward the plan. That's not what Israel wants. Hamas agreed that it would hand over leadership if the plan goes forward. It would step aside. Hamas agreed it would release all of the hostages if the GCC plan went forward. Israel said we can't move to say phase three, and instead it wants a 6-week extension and use the PR machine to make up a bunch of rubbish to say that there is a reason why we need to enter the war again and phase two is over and it is all Hamas's fault. And so Steve Witkoff needs to go over and say, we don't want to go to war with Iran. Can we do the deal? But we don't know whether Steve Witkoff is Israel first or America first, and that will determine the operation. There is still no Epstein files confirming what we already know, that it was an operation for Israel and Mossad to use intelligence agency to blackmail America to turn America first into Israel first. We had some theatrics. We had these fake binders where the influencers, which are all Zionists, pro-Israel, they were given binders. In the binders, there was nothing of substance. Kash Patel came in. He's the guy that said, we're going to expose the deep state. We got all the theatrics. Is Kash Patel in charge of the FBI? Because we were told that the FBI is burning all these documents. That's why they can't do it. So why? But FBI and Kash Patel was in. Is he Zionist? Is he Israel first or America first? Who's controlling the FBI right now? It's not quite clear, because apparently when Kash Patel went in, he couldn't stop the FBI from burning and hiding all the files. We know why. They are engaged in a cover-up operation for Israel, and we will get the redacted files. And we got some redacted files that redacted what had already been unredacted on the Epstein files that happened before. That's why I'm concerned about that. There is a battle, and we need to understand that. So let's get back into the second battle. What happened this week on the Israeli-Palestine conflict? So Israel cancelled the ceasefire. Rather than moving to phase 2. That was an announcement. They said it's because they strangled and murdered babies. We know that the family of the two children that were tragically victims of this whole thing, the family said that's a lie. The family said, please, everyone, stop talking about that. The family then released a letter to the Israeli government saying, stop weaponizing this. We know it was IDF bombing that led to the death of my family. And then also there was a video of the father that was released in November last year, and they were saving this up for this very PR moment. At the same time, because that narrative was perpetuated, where Trump spread all the lies that nothing about how the Palestinian people were treated, only about how the Israeli people were treated, that were in a war zone, obviously. The US decided to send another $4 billion to Israel. So since the Trump administration, he signed off on $12 billion under Trump. So that is still pushing the petrodollar proof of weapons network that requires a forever war based upon Israel foreign policy in the Clean Break memo. He then implemented new laws and rules that said any protesting against anti-Semitism, or so being pro-Palestinian, is now an act of arrest. So the Columbia students all were getting arrested. So this is in violation of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. They passed by Congress a law that said you can't be anti-Semitic. So the First Amendment protects what they call hate speech. It didn't say you can be hateful to Trump. It didn't protect being hateful to Christians. It didn't protect being, hateful to Islamophobia. It just did anti-Semitism, and the definition of anti-Semitism was as per a website that is controlled by Israel-funded organization. So now you can be arrested, and that is in violation of the protected speech. So America is now turning into what happened in UK, because it has got an Israel first policy rather than an America first policy. So Israel used that opportunity to announce another war crime. And we don't even get any attention to it. People don't talk about it. What's the war crime? They literally said we are weaponizing starvation again, and we are controlling down the whole occupation. We are not allowing children, women, or civilians to gain access to any food, any aid, any tents, any water, and we're not allowing any of it in. And we are currently into 6 days of a war crime from blocking it, from occupying a territory and weaponizing starvation and famine during Ramadan, a period where they would be fasting, and they got to be careful about what times they eat as well. So water's been halted, aid has been halted, fuel, which is what's required to prop up what's left of all the hospitals which have been bombed, and all done during Ramadan as well, which is a 1 month a 1 month period for Muslims. The US government right now under Trump looks more compromised than it ever has based upon these actions that happened this week and has happened. So we can quite categorically say that Trump's not a neocon, but he does have Zionist handlers and people that are controlling that, because it is pushing towards the war with Iran that is a neocon strategy based upon the clean break memo. So in the ceasefire, which was definitely as a result of Trump coming into power, so he gets credit for that, but he's got to use his power to get it into phase 2 and phase 3. And that's why those files need to be released, so that Americans know that there's a bad relationship here, and therefore stop sending money and focus on winning the AI war. So Israel has so far in phase 1 breached, and it was listed on the United Nations, 266 breaches of the ceasefire. So in order to make sure that it goes back into war. In that time, in Gaza, when there was meant to be a ceasefire, there's been 100 deaths in total. Qatar, who has been negotiating the ceasefire, has strongly condemned all of the moves, all of what's happened right now, weaponizing starvation, and came out and said that Qatar firmly rejects the use of food as a weapon of war and the deliberate starvation of civilians. Now, there was a big problem for Israel, because in the middle of this, Egypt and the GCC met, they had their conference, and they announced their two-state solution plan and an investment of $53 billion to rebuild Gaza, and to do it with no ethnic cleansing to Jordan, no ethnic cleansing to Egypt, and a realistic plan that involves putting in aid in order to rebuild and normalize and move forward. And Israel went nuts because Israel wants Trump's plan. Israel wants, and Netanyahu wants, Trump to occupy so that they can weaponize Hamas to resist against America, so that they can push forward war and violence, and then say, see, and get people and get America to not do a deal with Iran that would normalize, because Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and have a two-state solution, so that those American troops can be pushed into denuclear, using the nuclear narrative to make sure that US goes into another forever war with Iran that would be worse than all of the ones before, only so Israel can be the regional power rather than the GCC, and Israel having to stop receive the funding and get on with its neighbors instead. And that is why they can't stop the war. And that is why Steve Witkoff has to go there and make sure it gets to phase 2, rather than saying 6-week extension and all the games that are being played. So what did Trump do during this whole thing? Well, firstly, he did a cover-up operation for the whole thing, just like Antony Blinken and Biden. So exactly the same. And then he came out and threatened Palestinian civilians with death. He literally said, release all the hostages right now. So we know that Hamas just ignored it and said, no, we're sticking to the plan. And then America had to cave in and said, oh, we'll just leave it to do what Israel does. And then Israel said, all right, we want to cancel. We want no ceasefire. And that's why we are where we are right now. But Trump literally came out and said he made an announcement, release all the hostages. He met with some of the hostages. He highlighted, nothing that's happening to the Palestinian hostages, the torture they're going through, and just highlighted what's happening to some of the Israeli hostages to wind up the American people and to escalate. And then came out on Truth Social saying, to the people of Gaza, to the people of Gaza is a beautiful future, i.e. he did that AI image of himself and Netanyahu expelling everyone and lying down on a beach with people in bikinis, being in hotels. You have a beautiful future ahead, but not if you take hostages. So he's playing the confusion. He's not even saying Hamas is separate to the civilians. He's just saying, not if you take hostages. If you do, you are dead. So literally justifying what Israel will do next, and hell awaits you. So obviously there was massive condemnations from all of the industry, Saudi Arabia and everybody, massive pushback. And now we are in the middle of that psyop. There is a complete solid plan that doesn't involve America. America gets to focus on not the petrodollar, but its own vision. Israel gets to be contained into a two-state solution. Those with sovereign wealth funds and real surplus reserves get to normalize the region. America could do a security deal and the region could be in peace. You could normalize between Saudi Arabia, Iran, have a two-state solution, and Israel. And forever wars are over and the petrodollar is no longer useful. So Israel is trying to push America back into the petrodollar and the forever war model, which is would in the end mean that China win the AI race and the robotics race, and America would decline just like Britain did when the Bank of England managed to get it into World War I, and then World War II was transitioned in power over to America. So what did Israel do today and yesterday? So it decided to get more and more extreme in the West Bank. And by the way, the West Bank is where US Palestinian Authority puppet government is in charge, not Hamas. They are expanding as fast as they can. And to aggravate the armed resistance in the occupied territory, it decided to get outrageous during Ramadan. So yesterday and today, Israel burnt down a 12th century mosque in the West Bank. 12th century, historical. Who do we know that does that? ISIS. They take down, ancient history in order to outrage people. So that's how we know that they're using ISIS and Mossad operation as exposed by US aid funded by America, which sent 697 billion into ISIS training camps to push these operations forward. We now see the IDF is using the same strategy. So it burnt down a 12th century mosque in the West Bank. It is doing everything it can to outrage Muslims to try and get an attack so that they can then justify more and more weapons and more destruction to kill more civilians and do what they did. They did 5 mosque raids during Ramadan, during the last 2 days. They've done a daily raid in the West Bank. That's led to the expulsion of 40,000 Palestinians in the West Bank. They are trying to incite an uprising to justify the war right now, so that the Israeli government can remain intact and it doesn't get dismantled. They're dismantling all of the roads, so it's unlivable in the West Bank. Again, nothing to do with the Hamas war that they declared. They're taking out all of the infrastructure, making it unlivable, and they're doing exactly what they did in Gaza, displacing all of the civilians. They're now starving 1.8 million people in the West Bank, in Gaza. And they banned all aid, as we already covered. In the West Bank, they banned all media. This is exactly the precursor that they did. And then they had a false flag operation that led to death, destruction, and everything we know happened with the Hannibal Directive and everything as well that follows. So now, as we said, 6 days without any kind of aid or food or water going in. And what does Trump do? He starts talking about Iran in today's press conference and saying that Iran is next. And Putin countered that by agreeing to help with an Iran deal. So next week they meet in Saudi Arabia, to try and push things forward. At the same time, in the final part, we got some, statements. Basically, the Chinese foreign minister, they had a conference this week to lay out their vision. Wang Yi basically came out and said that Gaza belongs to the Palestinian people. The United Nations position is that it needs to be self-determination. There can be no US occupation. The GCC said the same thing. Everyone in the world said the same thing. The only two people that are veto voting, and Trump said he's going to leave UN. If he leaves UN, then he can no longer veto vote against Palestinian self-determination. They can only discredit it, which is what Israel has always done, saying the UN is anti-Semitic, the same old strategy. And then China came out at the conference and said Taiwan is an alienable part of the territory. So reiterating the one China policy in case there is any expansion of NATO into, redeployment of NATO into Asia, as has currently been happening. And China reiterated that its relationship with Russia will not be disrupted by any third parties. And Trump finally, which brings us to where we are now, issues that final warning to Hamas, just like he did last time, that hell will break over if they don't release all of the hostages. And Hamas wants to move to phase 2 in order to release all hostages, and Israel's trying to stop phase 2. And the GCC Egypt agreement is saying, here's the money, here's the plan, let's move to phase 2, let's normalize. And Israel's finding any way it can to make sure phase 2 does not happen. There is no two-state solution. And so that is essentially the current state of affairs. And that's why I believe there are two versions, the redacted files that doesn't reveal what Mossad in Israel did. And there's negotiations to try and get there as well. So we just need to avoid America going into a forever war with Iran in World War III, and not let Israel succeed in doing that. Instead, normalize and stop sending its money. Easier said than done. And I'll leave on a final thought that the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who's a Zionist, who's part of the Trump administration, announced that the Epstein files that they promised will be released unredacted are now going to be redacted due to a national security concern after the FBI said, and Kash Patel didn't stop, saying which documents can and can't be released and what redacted means. So Israel is redacting it, and that's what we need to watch for. What about the JFK files? Unredacted. What about the 9/11 files? Unredacted. Expose Israel and we can avoid World War III and we can get through this. And that is absolutely everything I've got for you for this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do very well. I want you to stay on the right side of that change. I want to do it with peace. I want to do it with love. I want to do it with unity. And to get there, I need this message to get out with more people. So if you are enjoying this, please become a subscriber on my free membership portal at simondixon.com. Please do follow me on X to get uncensored content. Please do follow me on Rumble in case YouTube take me down. Please do help me get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube so I can get it reviewed. And we can make sure that we please do share, please do like, please do help the algorithms so that when the review comes, they know that my content is popular as it used to be when I used to have 500,000 views on some videos before they started censoring me. So that's it for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 73. I will see you next week in episode 74. Peace.